They say dogs won't lead strangers into the wild unless something greater than instinct drives them. One quiet autumn evening on the windswept plains of Montana, a German shepherd appeared at the edge of an old ranch, its amber eyes holding a strange invitation. Luke Callahan, a Marine veteran freshly returned from the battlefield and his father's funeral, couldn't explain why he followed the dog into the shadowed woods. Perhaps it was the animal's persistence or something in those knowing eyes that seemed to carry a message. Perhaps it was simply that Luke had nowhere else to be, no one waiting for his return. The dog led him along a forgotten trail, buried beneath years of fallen leaves, deeper into the forest than Luke had ventured since childhood. The fading daylight filtered through pine branches, casting long shadows across the path. With each step, Luke questioned his sanity, yet something compelled him forward. The German shepherd would stop, look back with an eerily human expression, then continue on with determined purpose. At the end of the trail stood a weathered cabin that time itself had seemingly abandoned. The dog's behavior grew increasingly agitated, pawing at the door, whining with urgency. When Luke approached, he detected a faint smell of decay. Something was wrong. The door was locked from the inside. Forcing his way in, Luke was hit by the stale, suffocating air. His flashlight beam cut through darkness, revealing overturned furniture and years of neglect. But it was what he found in the small back room that made his blood run cold. A woman, barely alive, curled on the floor like a discarded doll. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her breathing shallow, and beside her a torn photograph of a family that looked strangely familiar. What Luke couldn't know in that moment was that his discovery would unearth secrets buried for generations. Secrets that powerful people in Lone Ridge would kill to keep hidden. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Luke Callahan had once believed war would be the defining challenge of his life. After a decade serving in the Marine Corps, deployed across Middle Eastern conflict zones, he'd seen humanity at its worst. He'd also lived with the weight of choices no person should have to make, including the split-second decision during an enemy ambush that saved his unit but cost a local child's life. That moment haunted his dreams, chased him through sleepless nights, and ultimately followed him home to Montana's wide-open spaces. Standing at the edge of the Callahan Ranch 3 months after his father's funeral, Luke barely recognized the place. The once proud family homestead had fallen into disrepair, fence posts leaning or fallen entirely, the barn roof sagging dangerously, and the few remaining horses looking thin and wary. Everett Callahan had been a hard man to know, harder still to love. A former Marine himself, Everett had battled his own demons with silence and whiskey, teaching his son that emotion was weakness. Their final phone call a year earlier had ended in bitter words Luke couldn't take back. Contrasting with Luke's hardened exterior was Sage Whitmore, 29, with auburn hair often pulled back in a practical ponytail and green eyes that carried a perpetual look of searching. As the last surviving member of her family line, Sage had spent years piecing together fragments of her father's mysterious past. Thomas Whitmore had died just 2 months ago, leaving behind cryptic references to his Montana origins and a family that had disowned him decades earlier. Beneath Sage's quiet determination lay a deeper pain, clinical depression that had worsened after her father's passing, bringing her to Montana with dual purposes, discovering family secrets and possibly ending her pain permanently. Neither Luke nor Sage knew of the third primary character in their unfolding drama, a German shepherd with unusual intelligence that locals occasionally spotted on the outskirts of town. The dog wore no collar but showed signs of previous training in its bearing and behavior. Some claimed it had appeared shortly after Everett Callahan's death, though none could say where it came from. The locals called it the Guardian, as it seemed to watch over certain parts of the forest with territorial vigilance. These 3 lost souls, A war-damaged veteran, a woman seeking answers, and a dog with mysterious purpose would soon be drawn together by forces set in motion decades before any of them existed. Their convergence would unearth long-buried secrets in Lone Ridge, where powerful interests had built fortunes on forgotten foundations, and where the line between justice and revenge had blurred with time. The Montana spring arrived with characteristic fickleness. Days of warm sunshine abruptly interrupted by biting cold snaps. Luke settled into a joyless routine at the ranch, rising at dawn to feed the remaining horses and assess the seemingly endless repairs needed. The isolation suited him. In town, people recognized his name and offered condolences that felt hollow. Some remembered him as a teenager, others simply knew him as Everett's boy who'd gone off to war. Few seemed to notice the shadows that followed him. One evening, as the sunset painted the distant mountains in fiery hues, Luke walked the western boundary of his property. A section of fence had collapsed entirely, creating an open invitation to the dense pine forest beyond. He'd need to fix it soon, though part of him questioned why he bothered maintaining a place that held so few happy memories. As he drove a replacement post into the ground, the distinct feeling of being watched prickled the back of his neck. Luke straightened, muscles tensing with a hypervigilance that had kept him alive overseas. Scanning the tree line, he spotted a shape slightly darker than the surrounding shadows. A German shepherd standing motionless, its gaze fixed on him. "Hey there," Luke called softly, instinctively keeping his voice calm and steady. The dog didn't move, neither approaching nor retreating. Its left hind leg favored the ground slightly, suggesting an old injury. Luke had grown up around working dogs. The ranches in these parts employed them for herding and protection. But this dog bore no collar, and something about its demeanor suggested it wasn't simply lost. When Luke took a cautious step closer, the dog remained still, ears pricked forward attentively. "You hungry, boy?" Luke reached into his pocket for the beef jerky he'd stashed there earlier. He broke off a piece and held it out, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The shepherd watched him with unnerving intelligence, but didn't approach. Another step forward and the dog finally reacted, not by retreating, but by turning slightly toward the forest, then looking back at Luke with what could only be described as expectation. When Luke remained where he stood, the dog took several steps into the trees, then stopped and looked back again. "You want me to follow you?" Luke asked, feeling slightly foolish, speaking to the animal as though it understood. Yet something in the dog's behavior seemed purposeful, almost urgent. The rational part of Luke's mind suggested ignoring the strange encounter and returning to the ranch house before darkness fell completely. Mountains at night were no place for a hike, especially along an unfamiliar path. But rationality had provided little comfort to Luke since his return from war. Without fully understanding why, he secured his hammer in his belt, pulled a flashlight from his truck, and climbed through the broken fence. "All right, lead on," he said to the dog, who immediately trotted deeper into the forest. The shepherd maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to ensure Luke followed. The forest grew denser, the well-worn path narrowing until it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding undergrowth. Luke felt the temperature drop as daylight faded, forcing him to switch on his flashlight. The beam bounced across tree trunks and patches of grass, occasionally catching the reflective gleam of the dog's eyes. Years of military training kept Luke alert to his surroundings, mental breadcrumbs marking their route. The dog seemed to move with absolute certainty, navigating without hesitation as though following an invisible map. After nearly 30 minutes of hiking, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing bathed in the last glow of twilight. In the center stood a cabin, or what remained of one. The structure sagged precariously, its roof caving in on one side and the porch collapsed at one corner. Weathered logs, darkened by decades of exposure, formed walls that had somehow withstood the relentless Montana seasons. A broken sign near the door hung by a single nail, swinging gently in the breeze, the half-faded words reading Whitmore Ranch, 1946. The German Shepherd stood at the cabin's threshold, its posture alert and tense. When it turned to Luke, a low whine escaped its throat, a sound that carried unmistakable urgency. Luke approached cautiously, years of combat experience making him wary of unknown structures. As he drew closer, he detected a faint odor emanating from the cabin. The unmistakable smell of human distress. "Hello!" Luke called out, one hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. "Anyone? Inside?" No response came, but the dog's whining intensified. It pawed at the door, which appeared to be jammed shut. Luke tested the handle. Locked or stuck, the cabin's windows were either boarded up or so covered with grime that seeing inside was impossible. The smell grew stronger here, reminiscent of sickness and desperation. Logic dictated caution, perhaps returning with proper authorities. But the dog's behavior, its relentless pawing and increasingly distressed whining, pushed Luke toward action. He searched near the porch, finding a solid piece of wood that could serve as a makeshift pry bar. Working the edge between door and frame, he applied steady pressure until something inside gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung inward an inch or two, then caught on debris behind it. Luke shoved a shoulder against it, forcing it wider, unleashing a wave of stale, fetid air that made him recoil momentarily. The dog pushed past him into the darkness, its nails clicking against the wooden floor. Luke's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing an interior frozen in time. Overturned furniture lay scattered about, a table on its side, chairs with broken legs, cobwebs draping from the ceiling. The floor was coated with dust and a spongy layer of dampness. The dog moved purposefully through the space, heading toward a narrow hallway at the back. Following the animal, Luke discovered a small room with its door jammed shut. The dog scratched frantically at the base, emitting a series of sharp, demanding barks. When Luke tested the handle, it refused to budge. The smell of human suffering was overwhelming now. "Stand back," he ordered the dog, which surprisingly obeyed, moving a few feet away but keeping its gaze fixed on the door. Luke rammed his shoulder against the wood once, twice, 3 times before the frame splintered and gave way. The beam of his flashlight revealed a nightmarish scene. A woman lay curled on the floor, her clothes filthy, hair matted with sweat and grime. Her skin was pale, lips chapped nearly to bleeding, eyes closed but fluttering weakly. She looked like she'd been there for days, perhaps longer. Luke dropped to one knee beside her, instinctively checking her pulse. Weak, but present. She was breathing in shallow, labored gasps. Years of battlefield triage kicked in as he assessed her condition. Severe dehydration, possible starvation, but no obvious physical injuries beyond scrapes and bruises. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he called, voice echoing in the cramped space. No response beyond a faint moan. Her eyes fluttered but remained closed. The dog nudged forward, gently licking the woman's hand before looking up at Luke with an almost human expression of concern. Luke fumbled for the water bottle he always carried, carefully lifting the woman's head to let a few drops trickle between her parched lips. She made a small sound, almost a whimper, and tried to swallow. As Luke's flashlight swept across her face, he noticed a small locket had fallen open on her chest. The photograph inside showed a family, a father with his arm around a young girl, the same girl who now lay dying on this cabin floor. Below the image, a tiny engraving read, "Sage Whitmore." With no cell service in the remote location, Luke knew he had only one option. Sliding one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, he lifted her from the floor. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp and unresponsive. The dog led the way back through the cabin, pausing at the broken entrance as if standing guard. "Good boy," Luke murmured as he maneuvered through the doorway with his precious cargo. "Let's get her home." The German Shepherd trotted ahead, illuminated occasionally by the flashlight's beam as it guided them back through the darkened forest. Luke's military training served him well, his stride purposeful despite the weight in his arms and the treacherous path. With each step he became more convinced that finding this woman wasn't chance. It was something far more deliberate. And the dog that had led him here seemed to know exactly what it was doing all along. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the pre-dawn stillness as emergency vehicles converged on the Callahan ranch. Luke had managed to carry Sage through the darkened forest to his truck, the German shepherd trotting alongside them the entire way. The ride back to his property had been tense, the woman's breathing growing more labored with each passing minute. The moment they'd reached cell service, Luke had called 911, his voice maintaining the calm urgency that had served him well in combat zones. Now, standing in his gravel driveway as paramedics loaded Sage into an ambulance, Luke felt the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving him hollow and shaken. Sheriff Ramirez approached, notebook in hand, his weathered face impassive beneath the brim of his department-issued hat. "Want to run through this again, Callahan?" he asked, eyes flickering between Luke and the German shepherd that had settled protectively at Luke's feet. "You're saying this dog led you to an abandoned cabin where you found a woman locked inside?" Luke nodded, suddenly aware of how implausible the story sounded. "The Whitmore place, apparently. There was a sign—" "The old Whitmore cabin," Ramirez clarified, scribbling in his notepad. "Been abandoned 40 years at least. Most folks around here don't even remember it exists." His gaze settled on the dog. "And you've never seen this animal before tonight?" "No, it just showed up at my fence line." Luke ran a hand through his short hair, leaving it disheveled. "Look, I know how it sounds." Ramirez's expression softened slightly. "Actually, it's not as strange as you might think. Dogs can sense when people are in danger. Search and rescue teams use them for a reason." He gestured toward the ambulance, where paramedics were securing Sage for transport. "She have any ID on her?" "A locket with the name Sage Whitmore." The sheriff's pen paused mid-stroke. "Whitmore? You sure about that?" "That's what was engraved on it. Why? Does that mean something to you?" Ramirez closed his notebook with deliberate slowness. "The Whitmores were one of the founding families of Lone Ridge. They owned half the valley before things went south for them in the 70s. There was some kind of scandal before my time, but bad enough that Thomas Whitmore left town and never came back." "Could be her father," Luke suggested. "Could be," Ramirez nodded toward the ambulance. "They're taking her to Lone Ridge Memorial. Small hospital, but Dr. Harris is good. You gonna follow them in?" Luke hesitated, glancing at the dog still sitting attentively at his side. "I should probably secure the ranch first." The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. The truth was, hospitals reminded him too much of field medical tents, the smell of antiseptic, forever linked to memories of wounded comrades. The sheriff seemed to understand. "I'll have Deputy Collins take your formal statement tomorrow. Get some rest, Callahan. You did good tonight." As the emergency vehicles departed, their red and blue lights fading into the distance, Luke found himself alone in the quiet dawn with an unexpected companion. The German shepherd looked up at him with what seemed like expectation. "Guess you need a name if you're sticking around," Luke said, kneeling to examine the dog more closely. Its coat was surprisingly clean for a stray, though matted in places. No collar, but its behavior suggested previous training. The animal submitted to his inspection with dignified patience. "How about Solace?" The name formed on his lips without conscious thought. The dog's ears perked forward as if in approval. "Solace it is, then." In the days that followed, Luke fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent repairing the ranch and caring for the remaining horses. Afternoons found him at Lone Ridge Memorial, sitting awkwardly in a vinyl chair beside Sage Whitmore's hospital bed. She'd been unconscious when they brought her in, severe dehydration, malnutrition, and the early stages of hypothermia, according to Dr. Harris. Each day showed small improvements, better color in her cheeks, stronger vital signs, occasional moments of semi-consciousness. Luke couldn't explain his vigil, even to himself. He had no connection to this woman beyond finding her, yet something kept drawing him back. Perhaps the mystery of how she'd ended up locked in that cabin, or simply the need to ensure his rescue hadn't been in vain. Solace accompanied him everywhere, waiting patiently in the truck during hospital visits, garnering curious glances from hospital staff who occasionally snuck the well-behaved dog treats. On the fourth afternoon, Luke arrived to find Sage sitting upright in bed, alert and wary. Her auburn hair had been washed and brushed, framing a face that carried both strength and vulnerability in its fine features. Green eyes, clear now without the haze of dehydration, fixed on him as he entered the room. "You found me," she said, her voice still raspy from disuse. "They told me a Marine carried me out of my family's cabin." Luke shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "The dog found you, really. I just followed." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "My knight in shining armor deflects credit to his noble steed?" Despite himself, Luke felt a corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Something like that. How are you feeling?" "Like I spent 3 days locked in an abandoned cabin without food or water." Her attempt at humor was undermined by a slight tremor in her hands. "Dr. Harris says I was maybe hours from—" She left the sentence unfinished. Luke pulled the visitor's chair closer to her bed. "What happened out there? The cabin door was locked from the inside, but—" "It wasn't," she interrupted, a shadow crossing her face. "I was examining some old furniture when the wind kicked up. The door slammed shut and either jammed or locked itself somehow. I tried for hours to force it open." Her voice dropped lower. "I screamed until my voice gave out, but there's no one around for miles. What were you doing there in the first place?" Sage's fingers played with the edge of her blanket. "Research, I suppose. My father, Thomas Whitmore, died 2 months ago. I found references to the Montana property in his papers. He never talked about his childhood, but I knew something painful happened here." She met Luke's eyes directly. "I'm a journalist by training. I guess the investigation is in my blood." "I'm sorry about your father," Luke said, the words automatic but sincere. "Thank you." She studied him for a moment. "The nurses mentioned your name. Luke Callahan. Any relation to Everett Callahan?" The question caught him off guard. "He was my father. Died 3 months ago." Something flickered across her face, recognition or perhaps surprise. "I'm sorry for your loss. Did you know our fathers may have known each other?" Luke frowned. "That's not likely. My father rarely mentioned anyone from his past." "Neither did mine." Sage adjusted herself against the pillows, wincing slightly. "Yet here we are, both back in Lone Ridge after our fathers' deaths, crossing paths in the most unlikely way." Before Luke could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Sheriff Ramirez entered, hat in hand, followed by a tall man in an expensive suit who surveyed the room with obvious displeasure. "Miss Whitmore," Ramirez began, "glad to see you recovering. This is Marshall Parker. He's with—" "Ridgeline Development," Parker finished, stepping forward with practiced confidence. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his handshake firm as he addressed Sage. "I was disturbed to hear about your ordeal, Ms. Whitmore. That old cabin should have been demolished years ago. It's a hazard, as you unfortunately discovered." "The cabin is on Whitmore property," Sage replied, a defensive edge to her voice. Parker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, that's why I'm here. The old Whitmore parcel was foreclosed upon decades ago. It's now part of a larger tract slated for development." He produced a folder of documents from his briefcase. "I've taken the liberty of bringing copies of the relevant records. The land legally belongs to Ridgeline now." Luke noticed Sage's posture stiffen, her journalist instincts clearly activated. "And what does Ridgeline plan to do with my family's historic cabin?" Historic is a generous term for a derelict structure, Parker replied smoothly. But to answer your question, we're breaking ground on Elk Ridge Resort next spring, a luxury retreat that will bring much-needed jobs and tax revenue to Lone Ridge. And my family's cabin will be removed along with other hazardous structures on the property. Parker's tone remained cordial, but his meaning was unmistakable. Sheriff Ramirez has agreed to post no trespassing signs immediately. For safety reasons, of course. Ramirez looked uncomfortable, but nodded his confirmation. It's for the best, Miss Whitmore. That place isn't safe. An awkward silence fell over the room, broken only when a nurse appeared to check Sage's vital signs. Taking the opportunity, Parker excused himself with another too-perfect smile, leaving his business card on the bedside table. Sheriff Ramirez lingered briefly, reminding Luke to stop by the station for his formal statement before following Parker out. When they were alone again, Luke found Sage staring at the documents Parker had left, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked. "No," she answered honestly. "That cabin might be falling apart, but it's the only connection I have left to my father's past. There are answers there. I know it." She looked up at Luke, determination replacing the vulnerability he'd seen earlier. "I'm not giving up that easily." Luke recognized the resolve in her eyes. He'd seen it in soldiers who'd decided a position was worth defending regardless of the odds. "What are you planning to do?" "First, get out of this hospital, then verify these documents." She gestured at Parker's folder. "And then," she paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully, "I need to go back to that cabin before they can demolish it." "You nearly died there," Luke reminded her. "Which is why I need your help." Her gaze was direct, challenging. "You and that remarkable dog of yours. Will you help me, Luke Callahan?" He should have refused. Getting involved in a property dispute with a powerful developer was the last thing Luke needed as he tried to rebuild his life. Yet he found himself nodding, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps the mystery, perhaps the connection to his father, or perhaps simply the first sense of purpose he'd felt since returning to civilian life. "I'll help," he said finally. "But we do this carefully. No more getting locked in abandoned cabins." Her smile transformed her face, bringing warmth to features previously tensed with worry. "Deal. When can I meet this heroic dog of yours?" "His name is Solace," Luke said, "and he's probably waiting impatiently in my truck right now." As if summoned by his name, a single bark echoed from the parking lot below. Sage laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Luke. "Solace," she repeated, testing the name. "Seems fitting somehow." Luke couldn't have known then how accurate that observation would prove to be, how a stray German shepherd would become not just a companion, but the bridge between two broken lives and the key to unraveling secrets that had shadowed Lone Ridge for generations. Nor could he have anticipated that the connection forming between him, Sage, and Solace would soon be tested by forces more dangerous than either of them realized. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "The Whitmore girl survived, and she's made a friend." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, not yet, but they both need to be dealt with. And that dog, there's something familiar about it." Another pause. "Yes, I'll take care of it. Some accidents are just waiting to happen." Dr. Harris initially objected to discharging Sage so quickly, but her determination proved stronger than medical caution. "I've been a stubborn patient since childhood," she explained to Luke as he helped her into his weathered pickup truck, Solace watching attentively from the bed. "My father used to say I'd argue with a fence post if I thought it was in my way." The mention of Thomas Whitmore brought a momentary shadow across her face. The familiar grief Luke recognized all too well. He'd seen it in his own reflection enough times since returning to Lone Ridge. "Where to?" he asked, starting the engine. I'd offer you a place to stay, but the ranch house isn't exactly in guest-ready condition." "The Silver Pine Motel will do for now," Sage replied, settling gingerly into the passenger seat, still moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body remembered recent trauma. "I booked a room before I went to the cabin." Luke noted her hesitation, but didn't press. The drive into town passed mostly in silence, broken only by Sage's occasional directions. Lone Ridge hadn't changed much in the decade since Luke had left. The same main street with its handful of shops, the diner where his father had taken him for rare birthday breakfasts, the small post office where everyone's business eventually became public knowledge. Several people waved or nodded as they drove past, recognition dawning on their faces when they spotted Luke behind the wheel. Small towns had long memories, and being Everett Callahan's son made Luke something of a local fixture, whether he wanted to be or not. The Silver Pine Motel sat on the eastern edge of town, a single-story structure with peeling green paint and a flickering neon sign. Luke helped Sage to her room, carrying her small suitcase while Solace trotted beside them, drawing curious glances from the elderly desk clerk. "I should check the cabin," Luke said as Sage unlocked her door. "See what else might be there before Parker gets no trespassing signs posted." Sage turned to him, determination flashing in her eyes. "I'm coming with you. You just got out of the hospital, and I'd still be in that cabin if not for you and Solace." Her tone brooked no argument. "Give me 30 minutes to shower and change. Please, Luke. I need to see it in daylight." Something in her expression, perhaps the hint of vulnerability beneath the stubbornness, made Luke relent. "1 hour," he countered. "I pick up some supplies in town and come back for you." The local hardware store hadn't changed since Luke's teenage years working summer jobs there. Old Mr. Gunderson still presided over the register, his gnarled hands counting change with practiced efficiency despite advancing arthritis. "Luke Callahan," the old man greeted him, genuine warmth in his voice. "Heard you pulled a woman out of the old Whitmore place. Brave thing you did." News traveled quickly in Lone Ridge. "Just happened to be in the right place," Luke deflected, loading flashlights, extra batteries, and heavy-duty work gloves onto the counter. "That right?" Gunderson's roomy eyes twinkled. "Also heard you had some help from a mighty fine German shepherd. Don't recall you having a dog before you shipped out." Luke hesitated. "He found me, actually. Seems to have adopted the ranch. Smart animals, German shepherds." Gunderson began ringing up the items. "Your father had one years back, you know. Best damn cattle dog I ever saw." This was news to Luke. "My father never mentioned owning a dog." Gunderson shrugged. "Wasn't one for sharing much, Everett, but he had that dog for years, until it disappeared one day. Broke his heart, though he'd never admit it." He paused, studying Luke. Strange coincidence, another German shepherd finding its way to Callahan Ranch after all these years. Before Luke could respond, the bell above the door jingled as Marshal Parker entered, immaculate in another expensive suit despite the dusty Montana afternoon. He nodded curtly to Luke. "Mr. Callahan quite the hero, I hear." His smile didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Though I understand you're planning another trip to the Whitmore property, I'd strongly advise against that." Luke maintained a neutral expression, the same mask he'd perfected during military interrogations. "Just picking up some general supplies for the ranch." "Of course." Parker placed a stack of papers on the counter. "Mr. Gunderson, I'd appreciate if you'd post these notices. The old Whitmore parcel is off limits pending development. Safety concerns." Gunderson took the papers with obvious reluctance. "People around here have been hiking those woods for generations, Marshal. Requires certain adjustments." Parker turned back to Luke. "I'd hate to see anyone get hurt out there. Those old structures are death traps, as Ms. Whitmore nearly discovered. Next time there might not be a good Samaritan and his dog passing by." The veiled threat hung in the air between them. Luke finished his purchase in silence, nodding a goodbye to Gunderson before exiting. Outside, Solace waited in the truck bed, ears perked forward attentively. The dog's gaze followed Parker through the store window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You don't like him either, huh?" Luke muttered, reaching back to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Smart boy." When Luke returned to the Silver Pine, he found Sage waiting outside her room, her damp hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd changed into jeans, hiking boots, and a flannel shirt that hung loosely on her still thin frame. Despite her obvious fatigue, her eyes burned with determination. "I ran into Parker in town," Luke said as she climbed into the truck. "He's already posting no trespassing notices." Sage buckled her seatbelt with deliberate precision. "All the more reason to hurry." The drive to the forest edge passed quickly, Luke parking his truck where the old logging road ended rather than risk damage on the rougher terrain ahead. Solace leapt from the truck bed, immediately alert, nose testing the air currents. "He's something special," Sage observed as the German Shepherd took up a position slightly ahead of them, pausing occasionally to ensure they followed. "Almost like he understands everything we're saying." "Sometimes I think he does," Luke admitted. "Gunderson mentioned my father had a German Shepherd years ago. I never knew." Sage's gaze sharpened with interest. "You think Solace could be related? After all these years?" "Doubtful." Luke adjusted his backpack. "But there's definitely something familiar about him, like he knows the ranch better than I do sometimes." The hike to the cabin took longer, with Sage still recovering her strength, but she refused Luke's occasional offers of assistance with stubborn pride. When they finally reached the clearing, she stopped abruptly, one hand flying to her mouth. In daylight, the cabin's state of decay was more apparent. Roof sagging dangerously on one side, porch partially collapsed, windows either broken or boarded up. Yet there was a strange dignity to the structure, a stubborn refusal to surrender completely to time and elements. "I don't remember much about finding it," Sage said quietly. "I was following directions from my father's papers, but by the time I arrived it was getting dark. I just wanted to look inside before heading back." She swallowed hard. "I never imagined I'd nearly die there." Luke studied her profile, noting the complex emotions playing across her face. Fear, yes, but also determination and something like reverence. "Ready to go in?" She nodded, squaring her shoulders. Solace had already trotted to the cabin door, which hung awkwardly where Luke had forced it open days earlier. The dog looked back at them, as if impatient for them to catch up. Inside, the cabin smelled of mold and neglect, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of sunlight that penetrated through gaps in the boarded windows. Luke switched on a flashlight, illuminating the main room with its overturned furniture and debris-strewn floor. "The room where I found you is back there." Luke indicated the hallway with his light beam. "But we should check the place is structurally sound before exploring too far." Sage moved with careful deliberation, examining fallen picture frames and running her fingers along the weathered log walls. "My father never talked about this place, but he kept a box of photographs. I recognize some of the background features from those images." She paused at a particular section of wall where faded height markings were still visible, names and dates scratched into the wood beside each line. "Thomas," she read, tracing the etching with her fingertip. "My father. He was 10 when this marking was made." Luke watched her silent communion with this fragment of family history, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. Solace, meanwhile, had begun investigating the cabin with methodical thoroughness, nose to the floorboards, as if following some invisible trail. "What exactly are we looking for?" Luke asked eventually. Sage turned from the wall markings. "Anything that might explain why my father left and never returned. His papers mentioned a family dispute over inheritance, but there were hints of something darker." Her expression grew troubled. The last entry in his journal mentioned the truth about Jackson's death and evidence in the north wall. Jackson, who was that? I don't know. Another family member, perhaps, or someone who worked for them. She gestured around the cabin. But clearly this place holds answers my father thought important enough to document. Luke was about to respond when Solis's behavior changed abruptly. The dog stood rigid before a section of the north wall, ears forward, tail straight. A low whine escaped his throat as he pawed at the floorboards. "What is it, boy?" Luke knelt beside him, running a hand along the rough planks. Nothing seemed immediately obvious, but Solis's insistence was unmistakable. Luke knocked on the floor, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate a space beneath. "There's something here," he confirmed, pulling out his pocket knife. "Help me pry up these boards." Together they worked at the edges of two floorboards that seemed slightly newer than those surrounding them. With a creak of protesting nails, the planks finally gave way, revealing a small compartment beneath. Solis whined with greater urgency as Luke directed his flashlight into the darkness. A metal box lay nestled in the space, coated with decades of dust, but otherwise intact. With careful hands, Luke lifted it out and set it on the floor between them. The simple latch showed no sign of lock or key. Sage's hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. This has to be what my father mentioned." The lid opened with a protesting squeal of hinges. Inside lay a collection of papers, yellowed with age, but preserved in the dry space beneath the floor. On top rested a faded photograph of two young men standing before the cabin, arms slung over each other's shoulders in casual camaraderie. They wore the working clothes of ranch hands, their faces bearing the easy smiles of youth. Sage lifted the photo with reverent care. "This one is my father," she said, indicating the taller of the two. "But I don't recognize the other man." Luke leaned closer, something about the second figure tugging at his memory. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the jaw, features he recognized from his own mirror. "It's my father," he said, disbelief coloring his voice. "That's Everett Callahan." Their eyes met over the photograph, the implications settling between them. Their fathers, who supposedly never spoke of each other, standing as friends outside this very cabin decades ago. Beneath the photo lay a stack of letters bound with faded twine, addressed to T and signed simply E, correspondence between their fathers, spanning years. The topmost envelope contained a newspaper clipping, its headline still boldly legible: "Ranch worker found dead at Whitmore property, accident or foul play?" "Jackson," Sage whispered, scanning the article. "Matthew Jackson, 27, found at the bottom of a ravine on Whitmore land in 1974. Initially ruled an accident, but questions remained." She looked up at Luke. "This must be what my father referenced." Further excavation of the box revealed legal documents, property deeds, a contested will, court filings, and a journal with Thomas Whitmore's name inscribed on the cover. Sage opened it with trembling fingers, flipping to the final pages. "I can no longer remain silent about what happened to Matt," she read aloud. "The truth has weighed on me and Everett for too long. We were young, scared, but that's no excuse for what we allowed to happen. My father swore it was an accident, but we both saw differently. The evidence is hidden in the north wall, enough to prove what really happened that night. If anything happens to me, Everett knows to protect this place and my daughter. We swore an oath." The journal entry ended abruptly, the remaining pages blank. Sage closed the book, her expression troubled. "My father died of an apparent heart attack. The autopsy wasn't conclusive." Luke's military instincts hummed with warning. "My father's death was similar. Heart failure, they said, but he had no history of cardiac problems." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by Solis's soft whine. The dog had moved to the cabin door, his posture alert, ears swiveling toward the forest beyond. "Someone wanted these secrets to stay buried," Sage said finally, gathering the documents with careful hands. and I think they're still covering their tracks." As if confirming her suspicion, Salas let out a low growl, his attention fixed on something beyond the cabin's broken porch. Luke moved quickly to the door, peering out into the clearing. Nothing seemed immediately amiss, yet the hair on the back of his neck stood on end, the same sensation that had saved him countless times in combat zones. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Now." They repacked the metal box hurriedly, Luke sliding it into his backpack while Sage tucked the journal into her jacket. Salas remained by the door, his body tense with alertness, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest. They had just stepped onto the porch when a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. Splinters erupted from the doorframe inches from Luke's head. Acting on combat-honed instinct, he grabbed Sage's arm and pulled her down behind the remnants of the porch railing. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice shifting to the command tone that had directed troops through firefights. Salas pressed close to them, his growl deepening. Another shot splintered wood above their heads. Luke quickly assessed their options. The shooter was positioned somewhere in the eastern tree line, making a direct retreat to the truck impossible. The forest to the west offered cover, but unfamiliar terrain. "When I count to 3, we run for those pines," Luke instructed, indicating a thick stand of trees to their right. "Stay low, move fast. Salas will lead." Sage nodded, her face pale but composed. The journalist in her had clearly been in dangerous situations before, even if not quite like this. 2, 3. They burst from behind the railing, Luke keeping his body between Sage and the presumed shooter's position. Salas bounded ahead, showing them the path of least resistance through the underbrush. Another shot cracked through the air, this one striking a tree trunk as they passed. The dense pines swallowed them quickly, providing momentary shelter. Luke didn't slow their pace, keenly aware that their pursuer would be repositioning. Salas moved with absolute certainty, picking a route that offered maximum cover while gradually circling back toward where they had left the truck. "Who's shooting at us?" Sage gasped as they paused briefly behind a fallen log, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "Someone who doesn't want us finding what was in that box," Luke replied grimly. "Parker, maybe, or someone working for him. Why would a resort developer care about a 40-year-old death? I don't know, but these woods belong to him now, officially at least." Luke peered over the log, scanning for movement. "And we're trespassing. That's hardly justification for attempted murder. People have killed for less." Luke checked that his backpack was secure, the metal box safely inside. "Ready to move again? The truck isn't far now." Sage nodded, determination overriding fear in her expression. They set off once more, Salas guiding them through the complicated terrain with uncanny precision. The German shepherd seemed to instinctively understand the need for stealth, choosing paths that minimized noise and visibility. No more shots disturbed the forest, but Luke maintained vigilance, the familiar state of combat alertness settling over him like an old coat. They finally emerged near the logging road where the truck waited, apparently undisturbed. Luke approached cautiously, checking underneath and around the vehicle before letting Sage near it. Finding nothing suspicious, he helped her into the passenger seat while Salas leapt into the truck bed, still vigilant. The drive back to Lone Ridge passed in tense silence, both of them processing what had happened. Only when they reached the town limits did Luke feel some of the tension leave his shoulders. "You can't go back to the motel," he said finally. "Whoever that was knows we found something. You won't be safe alone." Sage clutched the journal to her chest, her knuckles white. "And I'm not exactly swimming in options here, Luke." He made the decision without fully analyzing it. "You'll stay at the ranch. It's isolated, defensible, and no one would expect it." "Are you sure?" She studied his profile. "We barely know each other." "We know enough." Luke's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Our fathers were friends. They shared a secret that might have gotten them both killed, and now someone's shooting at us for finding it." He glanced at her. "Besides, Solace seems to have appointed himself your guardian. He's a pretty good judge of character." As if hearing his name, the German shepherd let out a soft bark from the truck bed. Sage's expression softened slightly. "Your dog is very persuasive." "He's not really my dog," Luke admitted. "More like we found each other at the right time. Kind of like us." The words hung between them, neither acknowledging the strange connection that had formed in such a short time. A bond forged through rescue, mystery, and now shared danger. At the ranch, Luke showed Sage to the small guest room that had once belonged to his mother before she left when Luke was just a boy. The space was dusty but intact, the simple furnishings covered with old sheets that he quickly removed. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's secure." "It's perfect," Sage assured him, setting down her small bag. "Thank you, Luke, not just for this, but for everything. Most people wouldn't have followed a strange dog into the woods, let alone carried out a dying woman." Luke shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't. Trust me, I've seen enough of humanity as a journalist to know genuine goodness when I encounter it." Before he could formulate a response, Solace appeared in the doorway, tail wagging gently as he looked between them. The dog carried something in his mouth, a battered leather-bound book that he dropped at Luke's feet with evident purpose. Luke bent to retrieve it, recognition dawning as he turned it over in his hands. "This is my father's journal. I found it after his death, but never finished reading it." He looked at the dog with amazement. "Where did you get this?" Solace merely sat, regarding them both with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets neither human could fathom. "I think," Sage said carefully, "that your dog is trying to tell us something." Luke opened the journal to where a frayed ribbon marked a page. His father's distinctive handwriting filled the yellowed paper. The entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. "T called today, first time in years. Says he's worried about. Might have found something in his papers. Told him to keep quiet, but he always was stubborn. Promised his girl would be safe if anything happened. Hope it doesn't come to that. The dog is ready if needed. He'll know what to do." Morning arrived with a soft golden light filtering through the curtains of the ranch house. Luke had been awake for hours, unable to sleep after the revelations of the previous day. He sat at the kitchen table, both journals open before him, his father's and Thomas Whitmore's, piecing together a story that had remained buried for 4 decades. Solace lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head when Luke would sigh or mutter about some particularly troubling passage. The dog's presence had become a strange comfort, a steady anchor in the increasingly turbulent waters of Luke's life. The fragmented narrative emerging from the journals painted a disturbing picture. Matthew Jackson had been a ranch hand at the Whitmore property in 1974, apparently discovering something that threatened the family's standing in the community. Whatever he had found had led to a confrontation on a rainy night, ending with his body at the bottom of a ravine on the property's northern border. Harold Whitmore Sage's grandfather had declared it an accident, but the journals suggested both Thomas and Everett had witnessed something more sinister. "Couldn't sleep either." Sage's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway wearing borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her frame, an old flannel shirt of Luke's and a pair of sweatpants cinched tight at the waist. "Just trying to make sense of all this," Luke replied, gesturing to the journals. "Our fathers were more than friends. They were witnesses to something they spent their lives running from." Sage moved to the ancient coffee maker, navigating Luke's kitchen with surprising ease. "Find anything about why someone would be shooting at us 40 years later?" "Maybe." Luke ran a hand through his short hair. "Jackson apparently discovered financial records showing Harold Whitmore was embezzling from investors in a land development scheme. When he threatened to expose it, Harold confronted him. According to my father's account, he and your father were nearby when they heard shouting, followed by the sound of someone falling. Sage brought 2 mugs of coffee to the table, sitting across from Luke. So my grandfather pushed Jackson off a cliff, and my father witnessed it. Along with my father, Luke accepted the coffee gratefully. They were both 19, working summer jobs at the Whitmore Ranch. Your grandfather convinced them to keep quiet, said it was an accident, that Jackson was drunk and belligerent. But they didn't believe him. Not entirely. They kept the financial records Jackson had found as insurance. Luke tapped a passage in Everett's journal. Your father was supposed to inherit the ranch, but after the incident, he had a falling out with Harold. He left Lone Ridge, taking the records with him. And the secret festered for decades. Sage sipped her coffee, eyes distant, until something made them both nervous again recently. Luke nodded, turning to the final entries in his father's journal. 2 months ago, my father writes about a new resort development being announced for Lone Ridge. Something about it triggered his concern. He tried contacting your father, which explains the cryptic notes I found after my father died. Sage's hands tightened around her mug. But why would a modern resort development connect to a 40-year-old embezzlement case? Before Luke could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel alerted them to a vehicle approaching the ranch house. Solis was immediately on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Luke moved to the window, tension coiling through his body as he recognized Sheriff Ramirez's patrol car. "Stay inside," he instructed Sage, heading for the front door. Solis followed, positioning himself protectively at Luke's side. Ramirez emerged from his vehicle, his expression grim beneath his department-issued hat. "Callahan," he greeted, eyes flicking to the German shepherd standing alert beside Luke. "Seems like trouble follows you these days. What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Got a report of trespassing and discharged firearms near the old Whitmore property yesterday." Ramirez's gaze was penetrating. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" Luke maintained a neutral expression. "Someone took shots at us while we were hiking. Pretty aggressive response to trespassing, wouldn't you say?" "Us?" Ramirez peered past Luke toward the house. "Ms. Whitmore with you?" "She needed a place to stay after being released from the hospital." Luke crossed his arms. "Any idea who might be taking pot shots at hikers on private property?" Ramirez sighed, removing his hat. "Look, Luke, I've known you since you were a kid. Your father and I served together before I joined the department. I'm not here officially." This admission caught Luke off guard. "Then why are you here?" "To warn you." The sheriff glanced around as if concerned about being overheard. "Parker filed the trespassing report, but he was unusually interested in whether anything was removed from that cabin. Said something about historically significant artifacts that legally belong to Ridgeline Development. That's convenient timing." "Isn't it?" Ramirez replaced his hat. "There's something else. I did some digging into Marshall Parker after our conversation at the hospital. Man came to Lone Ridge about 5 years ago, started buying up land. Very interested in specific parcels, including the old Whitmore property. Any connection to the area before that? Not that I could find easily, but here's the interesting part. His real name is Marshall Jackson Parker." Ramirez let that sink in. "Ring any bells?" Luke felt a chill despite the morning warmth. "Matthew Jackson was a ranch hand who died on Whitmore property in the 70s. "Thought that might mean something to you." Ramirez nodded. "Could be coincidence, but in my experience, there's no such thing in a town this small." He turned back toward his vehicle. "Watch yourself, Callahan, and Ms. Whitmore, too. Some land disputes get uglier than others." As the patrol car disappeared down the ranch's long driveway, Luke found Sage standing in the doorway, having clearly overheard the conversation. "Jackson," she repeated. "Parker is related to the man my grandfather allegedly killed. And now he owns the land where it happened. Luke felt the pieces clicking into place. This isn't about a resort development. It's about revenge. Sage clutched the doorframe, her face pale. He's the one who shot at us, who wanted the evidence to stay buried. Not buried, Luke corrected. Controlled. If Parker is Matthew Jackson's son or nephew, he might have spent years plotting this, acquiring the Whitmore land, planning to develop it, possibly even— He couldn't finish the thought. Possibly even arranging my father's death. Sage completed it for him. And your father's, too. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Solace whined softly, pressing against Luke's leg as if sensing his distress. We need to know exactly what's in those financial records, Luke decided, and we need to secure that evidence before Parker realizes we have it. Together they returned to the metal box, retrieved from beneath the cabin floor. Among the yellowed papers lay a ledger book with the letterhead of Whitmore Parker Investments, 19731. 974. Parker, Sage whispered, tracing the name. The connection goes back even further than we thought. Luke flipped through the ledger, his military training in intelligence analysis helping him decipher the financial entries. Looks like Harold Whitmore and someone named Gerald Parker were business partners, developing vacation properties throughout the region. Gerald could be Matthew Jackson's father, Sage suggested. Maybe he took his mother's maiden name after the scandal? Possible. Luke turned to the final pages where hasty notes had been scribbled in the margins. According to this, Harold was siphoning investment funds into a separate account. When property values dropped during the recession, the company couldn't repay investors. Sage leaned closer. So Matthew Jackson discovers his father is being embezzled from, confronts Harold Whitmore, and ends up dead at the bottom of a ravine. Luke closed the ledger. Our fathers witnessed it, kept evidence as insurance, and 40 years later, Matthew's son returns to exact revenge on both families. The ringing of Luke's cell phone interrupted their grim revelation. The caller ID showed Lone Ridge Town Hall. Luke answered cautiously, putting the call on speaker. "Mr. Callahan," a woman's professionally pleasant voice came through. "This is Diane from Mayor Wilson's office. There's an emergency town council meeting this afternoon regarding the Elk Ridge Resort development. As an adjacent property owner, your presence is requested." Luke exchanged glances with Sage. "What time?" "At 3 o'clock at Town Hall. The council will be voting on final approval for the development, including demolition permits for existing structures on the property." After confirming he would attend, Luke ended the call. This is happening too fast. Parker must be pushing the council to approve everything immediately, before anyone can raise questions about his connection to the Whitmore property, Sage agreed. "We need to present this evidence at the meeting. It's dangerous. If Parker really killed our fathers—" "If he did," Sage interrupted, determination flashing in her eyes, "then facing him in a public forum with evidence of his family's connection to the property is our safest option. He can't silence us both in front of the entire town council." Luke recognized the set of her jaw, the same stubbornness he'd seen when she insisted on leaving the hospital against medical advice. "You're not backing down on this, are you?" "My father died because of whatever happened 40 years ago. I owe him the truth." Her expression softened slightly. "But you don't have to be involved, Luke. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when someone shot at us," Luke countered. "And if Parker had anything to do with my father's death, I need to know." He glanced down at Solace, who sat watching them with alert attention. "Besides, I think my father wanted me involved. Why else would he train his dog to find you if something happened?" Sage knelt to stroke Solace's fur, her expression thoughtful. "It's still hard to believe a dog could be that purposeful, that intelligent. German shepherds are used by military and police for a reason. They can follow complex commands, remember training for years." Luke watched as Solace leaned into Sage's touch. My father must have known there was danger, prepared for the worst, by sending his most loyal companion to find his son and lead him to me." Sage smiled sadly. "Even from beyond the grave, our fathers were trying to protect us. They spent the hours before the town meeting organizing the evidence, the financial records, journal entries, and the newspaper clipping about Matthew Jackson's death. Luke made copies of everything, securing the originals in his father's old gun safe. Shortly before 3, they drove into town in Luke's truck, Solace riding in the back as always. The town hall parking lot was unusually full, indicating greater interest in the council meeting than typical. "Word must have spread about the resort approval," Sage observed as they found a parking space. "Small towns run on gossip." "Some things never change," Luke agreed, helping her from the truck. Inside, they found the meeting room already crowded with familiar and unfamiliar faces. Old-timers like Mr. Gunderson sat alongside younger residents, an unusual showing of civic engagement for Lone Ridge. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with thinning hair and an expensive suit, presided at the center of the council table. To his right sat Marshall Parker, impeccably dressed and surveying the room with calm confidence. Parker's expression shifted momentarily when he spotted Luke and Sage entering together, a flash of something cold crossing his features before his professional mask returned. Luke guided Sage to seats near the back, positioning himself between her and the exit, a habit formed during years of assessing tactical situations. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order, clearing his throat importantly. "As you all know, we're here to approve the final plans for Elk Ridge Resort, a project that promises to bring jobs and tourism dollars to our community. Mr. Parker of Ridgeline Development will present the details." Parker rose smoothly, moving to a prepared display board showing architectural renderings of a sprawling mountain resort. "Elk Ridge will be the premier luxury destination in western Montana," he began, his voice carrying confidence and authority. 200 guest rooms, a conference center, golf course, and spa facilities will transform the currently underutilized Whitmore parcel into an economic engine for Lone Ridge. As he detailed employment projections and tax benefits, murmurs of approval rippled through sections of the audience. Luke noticed the room seemed divided, older residents looking skeptical, while younger ones appeared more enthusiastic about potential job opportunities. "The project requires immediate approval of demolition permits," Parker continued, "for the remaining structures on the property, primarily the derelict Whitmore cabin, which poses significant safety hazards as evidenced by a recent accident involving a trespasser." At this, his gaze flicked meaningfully toward Sage, who stiffened beside Luke. Several heads turned in their direction, whispers spreading through the crowd. "Are there any questions before we move to a vote?" Mayor Wilson asked, clearly expecting few obstacles. Luke stood before he could second-guess himself. "I have concerns about the property's history and Mr. Parker's connection to it." A hush fell over the room. Parker's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. "Mr. Callahan, while I appreciate your interest, this is hardly the forum for—" "It's exactly the forum," Luke interrupted, moving toward the front of the room. Sage followed, clutching the folder of evidence. "Before this council votes, they should know that Marshall Parker has a personal connection to the Whitmore property that goes beyond commercial interest." Mayor Wilson frowned. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Luke said clearly, "that Mr. Parker's interest in the Whitmore land stems from a 40-year-old incident involving his family and the death of a man named Matthew Jackson." The reaction was immediate, gasps from the older residents, confused murmurs from the younger ones. Parker's mask slipped for a moment, genuine anger flashing across his features before he regained control. "This is absurd," Parker said dismissively, "and completely irrelevant to today's vote." "Is it irrelevant that your real name is Marshall Jackson Parker?" Sage stepped forward, her journalist training evident in her clear, authoritative tone. "That Matthew Jackson was your father, who died under suspicious circumstances on Whitmore property in 1974? The room erupted in whispers. Sheriff Ramirez, standing near the door, moved slightly closer, his hand resting casually near his holster. Parker's jaw tightened. My family history is not germane to this development project. It is when that history involves a business partnership between your grandfather, Gerald Parker, and Harold Whitmore, Sage continued, removing documents from her folder. A partnership that ended with allegations of embezzlement and your father's death. Luke watched the council members exchange concerned glances. Even Mayor Wilson looked troubled by these revelations. We have evidence, Luke added, suggesting that Matthew Jackson discovered financial improprieties and was killed to prevent him from exposing them, evidence that our fathers, Thomas Whitmore and Everett Callahan, preserved as witnesses to the incident. Parker's composed demeanor finally cracked. This is slander. You have no proof of these ridiculous claims. We have the original financial records your father discovered, Sage countered, holding up the ledger. Records showing Harold Whitmore embezzled from your grandfather's investment in their joint venture. Records that our fathers kept hidden for 40 years. And journal entries, Luke added, describing what they witnessed the night your father died. The tension in the room had become palpable. Several council members were whispering urgently to each other. Sheriff Ramirez had moved to a position where he could clearly observe everyone involved. Parker's face had drained of color, but his eyes burned with barely contained rage. My father fell to his death because he was drunk and careless. That's what the official report said. A report filed by Harold Whitmore's golfing buddy, who was sheriff at the time, Sage pointed out. Convenient, wouldn't you say? An elderly woman stood up from the audience. I remember that incident, she said, her voice wavering but determined. I worked at the county clerk's office. There were rumors about Matthew Jackson finding something damaging about the Whitmores, but nothing was ever proven. Because the evidence was hidden, Luke explained. Until now, Mayor Wilson banged his gavel, trying to regain control of the increasingly chaotic meeting. This is all very disturbing, but I don't see how it affects our vote on the development project. It affects it, Sheriff Ramirez spoke for the first time, stepping forward, because it establishes motive for recent events, like the suspicious deaths of Everett Callahan and Thomas Whitmore within weeks of each other. The sheriff's statement landed like a bombshell in the already tense room. Parker's expression shifted from anger to calculation. That's quite an accusation, Sheriff, he said coldly. Both men died of natural causes. Did they? Ramirez countered. Or did they die because they knew something about your father's death, something that might interfere with your plans for the property? Luke watched Parker's eyes dart toward the exit, assessing his options. The man was cornered, his carefully constructed veneer cracking under the weight of exposed secrets. This is all speculation and ancient history, Parker finally said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. The council should proceed with the vote as planned. I move to postpone the vote pending investigation of these allegations, called a council member. An older woman Luke recognized as his former high school teacher. These are serious matters that require examination. I second the motion, added another member. Mayor Wilson looked deeply uncomfortable but nodded. Motion carried. The vote is postponed until these historical matters can be properly investigated. Parker slammed his presentation pointer onto the table. This is outrageous. You can't delay based on unfounded accusations about events from 40 years ago. We can and we will, the mayor replied, finding some backbone at last. Sheriff, would you like to add anything? Ramirez stepped into the center of the room. In light of the information presented today, I believe we should also investigate any connection between these historical events and the recent deaths of Everett Callahan and Thomas Whitmore. He turned to Parker. Mr. Parker, I'd appreciate you remaining in town while we look into these matters. Parker's face contorted with barely controlled fury. For a moment, Luke thought he might lash out physically. Instead, he gathered his presentation materials with jerky movements. "You're all making a grave mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This development would have saved your dying town." "Not at the cost of justice," Sage replied steadily. As Parker stormed toward the exit, he paused beside Luke and Sage. "This isn't over," he hissed, quietly enough that only they could hear. "You have no idea what you've started." The threat hung in the air as he pushed past them and out of the town hall. The meeting dissolved into excited conversation, residents clustering to discuss the shocking revelations. Sheriff Ramirez approached Luke and Sage, his expression serious. "You two stirred up one hell of a hornet's nest," he said. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next." "What do you think that will be?" Sage asked. "Parker won't give up easily. Men like him with money and connections rarely do." Ramirez adjusted his hat. "I'd watch your backs if I were you, and keep that dog of yours close." As if summoned by the mention, a commotion at the town hall entrance drew their attention. Salas had somehow freed himself from the truck and now stood in the doorway scanning the room until his gaze locked on Luke and Sage. The German shepherd trotted directly to them, ignoring the startled reactions of the townspeople. "Speaking of your guardian angel," Ramirez remarked with a slight smile. "Smart animal." Luke knelt to check Salas's collar, ensuring he hadn't broken anything to escape. "Too smart sometimes. I swear he understands every word we say. Some dogs are special that way." Ramirez patted Salas's head with unexpected gentleness. "Your father always said this one was exceptional." Luke looked up sharply. "You knew this was my father's dog?" Ramirez nodded slowly. "Recognized him immediately. Everett trained him personally. Said he was insurance for when he couldn't be around anymore." The sheriff's eyes held a knowing look. "Seems like the insurance paid off." Before Luke could question him further, Clara from the local cafe pushed through the crowd, her usually cheerful face etched with concern. "Blue Sates, you need to come quickly," she said breathlessly. "Someone set fire to the old cabin." Smoke billowed above the tree line, visible from miles away as Luke's truck barreled down the Forest Service road. Beside him, Sage gripped the dashboard, her face a mask of determination belying the fear in her eyes. In the truck bed, Salas stood braced against the wind, nose pointed toward the dark plume rising from where the Whitmore cabin stood. "He's destroying evidence," Sage said, her voice tight, "burning it all to the ground." Luke's jaw clenched as he navigated the rutted road. Parker didn't waste any time. Sheriff Ramirez had immediately called the volunteer fire department. But in rural Montana, response times were measured in tens of minutes, not seconds. By the time they reached the clearing, flames had already engulfed half the cabin's structure, hungrily consuming the aged timber. Luke skidded the truck to a stop at a safe distance. Before he could issue a warning, Salas leapt from the truck bed and bounded toward the burning building. "Salas!" Luke shouted, panic rising in his throat. The dog paused, looking back at him with what seemed like purposeful intent, then continued circling the cabin's perimeter, keeping a cautious distance from the flames. "He's checking for people," Sage realized aloud, "making sure no one's trapped inside." The heat was intense, even from where they stood. Decades-old wood burned with frightening efficiency, sending embers and ash spiraling into the autumn sky. The crack and groan of collapsing timbers punctuated the roar of the fire. "There's nothing we can do," Luke said, the helplessness in his voice unmistakable. "It's too far gone." Sage stood transfixed by the destruction, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "That was the last physical connection to my father's childhood. To our family's history." Luke put a protective arm around her shoulders, a gesture that felt both foreign and natural simultaneously. "The building may be gone, but we still have the evidence, the truth." The distant wail of sirens announced the belated arrival of the fire truck. Solace returned to them, fur smelling of smoke but otherwise unharmed. The German shepherd sat at their feet, watching the cabin burn with an almost human expression of sorrow. Sheriff Ramirez's patrol car arrived moments before the fire truck, the lawman surveying the scene with grim resignation. "Parker?" he asked simply, approaching Luke and Sage. "Who else?" Luke replied. "Timing's too convenient to be coincident." "Arson's a felony," Ramirez noted, removing his hat as the heat washed over them, "but proving he did it personally will be difficult." "He wouldn't have done it himself," Sage said bitterly. "Men like Parker have people for dirty work." The fire team deployed with practiced efficiency, though their efforts focused on containing the blaze rather than saving the structure. The cabin was clearly beyond rescue, its roof now completely collapsed into a fiery crater of what had once been the main room. As they watched the firefighters work, Ramirez's radio crackled to life. He listened to the dispatcher, his expression darkening. "I've got to head back to town," he said, replacing the radio on his belt. "There's been an incident at your ranch, Callahan." Luke's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "Break-in reported by a neighbor. Deputies are on scene now." Ramirez's eyes conveyed the gravity his professional tone attempted to moderate. "You should get back there." The drive to the ranch passed in tense silence, Luke pushing his aging truck to speeds it hadn't attempted in years. Solace stood rigid in the truck bed, ears flattened against the wind, while Sage repeatedly checked her phone for updates from the deputies. When they finally turned onto the ranch's long driveway, the flashing lights of 2 patrol cars illuminated the approaching dusk. Luke's heart sank as the house came into view. The front door hung splintered from its hinges, windows shattered, and belongings strewn across the front yard. Deputy Collins, a young officer who had graduated high school with Luke, approached as they parked. "Place was ransacked pretty thoroughly," he reported. "Neighbors saw an unfamiliar truck speeding away about an hour ago and called it in." Luke surveyed the damage with a soldier's detachment, a defense mechanism against the violation he felt seeing his family home desecrated. "They were looking for something specific," he observed, noting the methodical nature of the destruction. "Drawers pulled out and emptied, furniture upended, but nothing randomly destroyed for destruction's sake." Solace pushed past them into the house, his training evident as he systematically checked each room, returning moments later with an anxious whine. "The safe," Luke realized suddenly. They were after the evidence. He rushed to his father's study, Sage and Deputy Collins following. The gun safe stood in the corner, its heavy steel door still securely closed. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They couldn't get in. "Small mercies," Sage murmured, taking in the chaos of the ransacked room. While Collins took their statement, Luke and Sage began the disheartening task of cleaning up. Solace remained vigilant, patrolling the perimeter of the house with military precision. "He can't get to us directly, so he's attacking everything around us," Sage observed, carefully righting a bookshelf. "The cabin, your home. He's trying to erase the past and intimidate us in the present." Luke gathered the scattered photographs of his parents, the glass frames cracked but the images intact. "He underestimates what we've already survived." Night had fallen completely by the time the deputies left, promising increased patrols in the area. Luke secured the broken front door as best he could, jamming a chair beneath the handle as a makeshift barricade. In the kitchen, he found Sage staring out the window into the darkness, her reflection in the glass showing an expression he recognized all too well. The 1,000-yard stare of someone processing trauma. "I never told you why I really came to that cabin," she said without turning around, her voice quiet but steady. "The journal was part of it, yes, but there was more." Luke waited, sensing she needed to tell this story at her own pace. "After my father died, I fell apart." Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the windowpane. "The depression I'd managed for years became overwhelming. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The grief counselor called it complicated mourning, but that clinical term didn't capture the darkness. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and strength. I came to Lone Ridge planning to investigate my father's past, yes, but I also came here to end my life. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Luke felt a pang of recognition, not shock, but profound understanding. The cabin seemed fitting, she continued. The place where my family's troubles began would be where mine ended. Poetic in a morbid way. A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. But then the door jammed, and suddenly I was facing death not by choice, but by circumstance. "And you fought to live," Luke observed quietly. "I did." Sage's voice strengthened. 3 days trapped in that cabin, I realized I wanted to live. Ironic, isn't it? I went there to die and instead found a reason to survive. Luke moved closer, not touching her, but offering his presence. "It's not ironic. It's human." "What about you?" she asked, her gaze piercing through his carefully maintained barriers. "What demons followed you home from war?" Luke rarely spoke about his military service, had perfected the art of deflection when well-meaning civilians asked about his experiences, but Sage's honesty demanded equal vulnerability. "There was a village in Afghanistan," he began, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "My unit was clearing buildings after intelligence reported insurgent activity. Standard procedure, we'd done it dozens of times before." He moved to the kitchen table, needing to sit as the memory surfaced. Solace appeared silently at his side, resting his head on Luke's knee, as if sensing his distress. The building was supposed to be empty except for possible combatants, but when I entered the third room, there was a child, a boy, maybe 8 or 9. Luke's voice grew hollow. He was scared, running toward me. I couldn't tell if he was running for help or if he'd been... He couldn't finish the thought. "If he'd been forced to wear explosives," Sage completed softly, understanding the impossible situation. Luke nodded, his throat tight. "Split-second decision. The rest of my unit was behind me. If the boy was being used as a weapon and I let him reach us," his hands clenched into fists on the table, "I fired." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock, a sound that had marked time in the Callahan household for generations. "There were no explosives," Luke finally continued. "Just a scared kid who probably thought American soldiers would help him." His voice cracked slightly. "I've relived that moment every night since. The what-ifs torture me. What if I'd hesitated? What if I'd been wrong the other way and gotten my entire unit killed? What if there had been no war, no insurgents using children, no impossible choices forced on young men with guns?" Sage interrupted gently. She moved to sit beside him, close enough that her presence offered comfort without demanding response. "You were placed in an unwinnable situation, Luke. Doesn't make me feel any less like a monster. The fact that it haunts you proves you're not." She reached out tentatively, her hand covering his clenched fist. "Monsters don't wake in the night, tormented by their actions." Solace whined softly, pressing closer to Luke's leg. The dog's warm weight provided an anchor to the present when memories threatened to drag him into the past. "After I came home," Luke continued, "I couldn't talk to my father about any of it. He was from a different generation of warriors, the kind who buried their trauma beneath silence and whiskey. By the time I found the words, he was gone. And you never got to tell him about the boy," Sage concluded, "or hear him say he understood, that I wasn't the monster I feared I'd become." Luke scratched behind Solace's ears, drawing comfort from the simple connection. "I guess we both came back to Lone Ridge carrying burdens we couldn't put down. And both found ourselves in the middle of a 40-year-old mystery instead." Sage's hand remained on his, neither of them acknowledging the contact, yet neither pulling away. Do you think Parker really killed our fathers?" The question brought Luke back to their immediate crisis. The timing is too convenient. Both die of apparent heart failure just as Parker's development plans are finalizing, and both had information that could connect him to Matthew Jackson. "Heart attacks can be induced," Sage said grimly. "Certain substances are virtually undetectable unless specifically screened for. And small-town autopsies aren't exactly thorough." Luke had wondered about this since first learning of the connection between their fathers. If Parker learned they were communicating again, sharing concerns about his development plans, he could have eliminated the only witnesses to whatever really happened to his father. Sage withdrew her hand, rubbing her temples. "But how do we prove it? The cabin's gone. Any physical evidence that might have been there is destroyed." "We still have the financial records and journals," Luke reminded her, "and something Parker doesn't know about." He rose, moving to the bookshelf where he retrieved a small metal box similar to the one they'd found beneath the cabin floor. "My father kept this hidden behind a false panel in his closet. I found it after his death, but couldn't make sense of it then." Inside lay a collection of items, several vials of soil samples, each labeled with coordinates, photographs of the ravine where Matthew Jackson had died, and a microcassette tape labeled simply Matthew J. Final Day. "Your father recorded something?" Sage asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "Apparently." Luke examined the tape. "But I have no way to play it. Nobody's used microcassettes in decades." "Clara might," Sage suggested. "At the cafe. She collects vintage electronics. Says modern technology moves too fast." Despite the chaos surrounding them and the weight of their shared confessions, Luke felt a spark of hope. "First thing tomorrow, then. For tonight, we should try to rest." He glanced toward the broken front door. "Though I'm not sure how safe we are here." Solace barked once, decisively, as if offended by the suggestion he couldn't protect them. Sage smiled for the first time since the cabin fire. "I think your father's insurance policy has us covered." They took turns keeping watch through the night, neither fully trusting that Parker wouldn't make another move against them. Solace remained vigilant, patrolling between rooms with quiet efficiency, occasionally stopping to check on whichever human was attempting to rest. Dawn arrived with gunmetal gray skies threatening rain, fitting weather for their somber mood. Luke made coffee while Sage cataloged the items that had been damaged or destroyed in the break-in. Though the intruders hadn't found the safe or the hidden box, they had left the Callahan home in disarray, another violation in a growing list. "Ready to see if Clara can help us with this?" Luke asked, holding up the microcassette as Sage entered the kitchen. Before she could answer, Solace suddenly stood at attention, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he faced the window. Luke's combat instincts immediately activated. He moved to the side of the window, cautiously peering out without exposing himself directly. A black SUV had parked at the end of the long driveway, still several hundred yards from the house. Two men in dark clothing stood beside it, appearing to survey the property. "Parker's men?" Sage asked, keeping her voice low as she joined him at the window. "Likely." Luke assessed their options with tactical precision. "They're probably checking if we're home before making another attempt at the safe. We should call Ramirez." "And wait for him to drive from town? They'll be gone by then." Luke made a quick decision. "We need to get to Clara's, see what's on that tape. It might be the evidence we need to prove Parker's involvement in all this." Moving with practiced efficiency, Luke gathered their essential evidence, the journals, financial records, and the metal box containing his father's collected items. He stuffed them into a backpack while Sage kept watch on their unwelcome visitors, who had now started slowly advancing up the driveway on foot. "Back door," Luke instructed, grabbing his truck keys. "We'll circle through the barn, take the utility road behind the property. They won't see us leave." Solace led the way as they slipped out the kitchen door, staying low and using the farm buildings for cover. The old barn's rear door opened onto an overgrown track that had once connected the Callahan property to neighboring ranches. Luke's truck was parked on the far side, hidden from view of the main house. "They'll figure out we're gone pretty quickly," Sage noted as they climbed in, Solace jumping into the truck bed with practiced ease. "But they won't know where we've gone." Luke started the engine, keeping the speed slow to minimize noise as they followed the utility road away from the property. "Advantage of growing up here, I know every back route in the county." Instead of heading directly to town, Luke took a circuitous path through Forest Service roads and old ranching trails, eventually approaching Lone Ridge from the south rather than the more obvious eastern approach from his property. Clara's Corner Cafe sat on the edge of Main Street, a cozy establishment with checkered curtains and the perpetual smell of fresh pie. Despite the early hours, several customers already occupied the worn booths, nursing coffee and trading local gossip. At a corner table, Sheriff Ramirez was midway through what appeared to be his usual breakfast. Clara herself, a robust woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing, spotted them immediately. "Luke Callahan and the famous Sage Whitmore," she announced, loud enough to turn heads throughout the cafe. "Stirring up more trouble, are you?" "Just looking for some breakfast and a favor," Luke replied, guiding Sage to the counter while scanning the room for unfamiliar faces. Solace remained outside, maintaining his self-appointed guard duty. "Heard about your place getting ransacked," Clara said more quietly, pouring coffee without being asked. "And the cabin burning down. Shameful business. That's why we need your help." Sage produced the microcassette from her pocket. "We heard you collect vintage electronics. Any chance you have something that could play this?" Clara examined the small tape with interest. "Haven't seen one of these in years. Reporter's tape by the look of it." She glanced between them, curiosity evident in her expression. "I might have an old player at home. What's on it that's got you sneaking in my back door looking like you've seen ghosts?" "Potentially evidence connecting Marshall Parker to our father's deaths," Sage answered directly, keeping her voice low. Clara's expression hardened. Never did trust that smooth-talking developer. Eyes too cold for his smile. She pocketed the tape. "Give me 30 minutes. Meanwhile, you two look like you could use food and a safe place to catch your breath." She guided them to a booth in the back corner with a clear view of both entrances, a position Luke would have chosen himself for tactical advantage. Sheriff Ramirez nodded acknowledgement from his table, but didn't approach, offering them privacy while maintaining a protective presence. Clara returned to the kitchen and soon emerged with plates of eggs, bacon, and toast. "Eat," she instructed firmly. "Can't fight corruption on empty stomachs." They were midway through the much-needed meal when the cafe door opened, admitting a blast of cool air and Marshall Parker himself. Unlike his usual polished appearance, he looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled as if he'd spent the night in it. His cold gaze swept the room, landing on Luke and Sage with predatory focus. An immediate hush fell over the cafe. Regulars who had witnessed yesterday's town meeting watched with undisguised interest as Parker approached their table, ignoring Sheriff Ramirez's watchful presence. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Callahan?" Parker's voice carried forced pleasantness. "I thought we might have a private conversation about yesterday's misunderstanding. Burning down historic structures and breaking into homes seems like more than a misunderstanding," Sage replied evenly. "Serious allegations. Without proof." Parker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I came to offer a compromise, a mutually beneficial arrangement." Luke said nothing, allowing Parker to continue while assessing potential threats. The man appeared to be alone, though Luke suspected his associates weren't far away. "The development proceeds as planned," Parker proposed, with a memorial dedicated to both the Whitmore and Jackson families. "Full acknowledgement of your family's historical significance to the area, Ms. Whitmore, plus generous compensation for both of you to ease any lingering concern." "You're trying to buy our silence," Sage translated flatly. "I'm offering a reasonable solution that benefits everyone." Parker's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the desperation beneath. The alternative is protracted legal battles that will drain your resources and ultimately change nothing. The land is legally mine." "And our fathers?" Luke asked, speaking for the first time. "Was killing them part of your reasonable solution?" Parker's expression flickered between shock and calculation. "I had nothing to do with their deaths. Heart failure is unfortunately common among men their age." "Convenient timing, though," Sage pressed, just as they were reconnecting, sharing concerns about your development plans and your connection to Matthew Jackson. "You have no proof of anything beyond your wild speculations." Parker's voice hardened. "But continuing down this path will make enemies you can't afford, Miss Whitmore. You too, Callahan."
Before either could respond, a low growl announced Solace's presence. The German Shepherd had somehow entered through the kitchen, positioning himself protectively beside their booth. His focus remained entirely on Parker, hackles raised.
Parker took an involuntary step back, genuine fear flashing across his face. "Control your animal, Callahan." "He's not mine," Luke replied calmly. "He belonged to my father, and he seems to have strong opinions about you." Sheriff Ramirez approached, coffee mug in hand but purpose in his stride. "Everything all right here?" "Sheriff, I was just leaving." Parker straightened his tie, composure returning. "Consider my offer," he added, addressing Luke and Sage. "It expires at noon. After that, well—" He let the implied threat hang in the air before exiting the cafe, the bell above the door jingling with incongruous cheerfulness at his departure.
"Man doesn't give up easily," Ramirez observed, watching through the window as Parker drove away.
"He's desperate," Luke noted. "Making offers, issuing threats in public. That's not the behavior of someone in control." "He knows we're close to something," Sage agreed. "Something on that tape has him scared." As if summoned by mention of the tape, Clara returned, slightly breathless, a battered microcassette player clutched in her hands. "Found it," she announced triumphantly. "Batteries still work even."
The small group moved to the cafe's back office for privacy. Luke, Sage, Sheriff Ramirez, and Clara, with Solace standing guard at the door. Clara inserted the tiny tape, adjusting the volume before pressing play.
Static filled the room, followed by a young man's voice, clear despite the tape's age. "April 15th, 1974. Matthew Jackson recording. Harold Whitmore has been embezzling from the investment fund for years. I've documented transfers to offshore accounts totaling over $300,000, 0 cents. Gerald Parker, my father, has been kept in the dark, thinking their business is simply struggling due to the recession. I'm meeting Harold tonight to present what I've found. Give him a chance to come clean before I take this to the authorities. Thomas and Everett are nearby if things get heated. Harold has a temper, especially when drinking."
A pause. Then, "If anything happens to me, this recording confirms I feared for my safety when confronting Harold Whitmore. The financial evidence is hidden at coordinate markers noted in my ledger. Dad, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry. I couldn't let him keep stealing from you and the other investors."
The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Luke exchanged glances with Sage, both processing the implications of what they'd just heard.
"Matthew Jackson knew he might be in danger," Sheriff Ramirez said slowly. "This recording was his insurance policy."
"Insurance that never reached anyone who could use it," Sage added. "Until now." Luke thought of the soil samples in his father's metal box, each labeled with coordinates. My father must have collected evidence from the locations Matthew mentioned in his ledger, physical proof of whatever happened that night. "And kept it all these years, alongside this recording?" Ramirez nodded. "Everett always was thorough." Clara, who had remained uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. "Harold Whitmore was a mean drunk. Whole town knew it, but looked the other way because of his money and family name. If Matthew confronted him while he was intoxicated, it could have led to violence," Luke finished, "followed by a cover-up that our fathers witnessed." And 40 years later, Harold's grandson comes home to find you two stirring up the past. Ramirez rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Problem is, this recording suggests Harold might have killed Matthew, but it doesn't connect Marshall Parker to your father's deaths. No, Sage agreed, determination hardening her features, but it proves motive. Parker returns to Lone Ridge, buys the Whitmore property where his father died, and suddenly both witnesses to whatever happened that night die of identical heart failures? Circumstantial, Ramirez warned. Not enough for an arrest, but enough for a warrant to investigate Parker more thoroughly, Luke suggested. The sheriff considered this. Possibly. I'd need to consult the county attorney. A commotion from the main cafe interrupted their discussion. Raised voices, the scrape of chairs being pushed back hastily. Clara moved to the door, peering out before turning back with alarm. "Parker's men," she hissed. "4 of them. They're asking where you went." Luke's military training kicked in immediately. "Back exit. Through the kitchen. Leads to the alley," Clara confirmed. "I'll stall them." "I'll create a distraction," Ramirez added, checking his sidearm. "Get that evidence somewhere safe, Callahan. We'll need it if we're going to stop Parker." As they slipped through the kitchen, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressed on Luke with physical force. Their fathers had carried this burden for 40 years, the knowledge of a crime covered up, evidence preserved but never used, a silent pact to protect each other from potential retribution. The alleyway behind Clara's cafe offered momentary shelter, but Luke knew they couldn't linger. Parker's men would search the building thoroughly once they realized their quarry had slipped away. Solis led the way, his training evident in how he moved, alert but silent, pausing at corners to ensure the path ahead was clear. "Where to now?" Sage whispered, clutching the backpack containing their precious evidence. The microcassette player and tape were safely tucked inside, alongside the journals and financial records. "We need somewhere they wouldn't expect," Luke replied, scanning their surroundings with tactical precision. "Somewhere we can regroup and plan our next move." A sudden inspiration struck him. Dr. Monroe's veterinary clinic. It's on the edge of town, and Solis is due for a checkup anyway. A perfect cover. They moved quickly through Lone Ridge's network of back streets, avoiding Main Street, where Parker's men would likely be searching. The October morning had turned gloomy, low clouds threatening rain, fitting weather for their increasingly dire situation. Oak Hollow Veterinary Clinic occupied a modest building with a fenced yard behind it. Dr. Eliza Monroe had taken over the practice from her father years ago, becoming the town's primary animal doctor. More importantly to Luke, she had been a close friend of his mother's before Sarah Callahan left town, abandoning her husband and young son. A bell chimed softly as they entered the empty waiting room. Moments later, Dr. Monroe emerged from an examination room, her expression shifting from professional welcome to concerned recognition. "Luke Callahan," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "And you must be Sage Whitmore. The whole town's talking about you two." Her gaze dropped to Solis, who sat attentively at Luke's side. "And this remarkable dog." "We need a place to lay low for a bit," Luke explained, keeping his voice low despite the empty waiting room. "Parker's men are looking for us." Understanding immediately darkened her features. "Follow me." She led them through the clinic to her private office, a cluttered space filled with veterinary journals, framed diplomas, and photographs of animals she had treated over the years. Among them, Luke noticed with surprise, was a faded picture of a much younger Everett Callahan holding a German Shepherd puppy. "That's my father," he said, moving closer to examine the photograph. "And that's Atlas, your father's prized dog." Dr. Monroe smiled sadly. "Everett was devastated when Atlas disappeared. Searched for months." "Atlas," Luke repeated, the name tugging at some distant memory. He glanced at Solis, who had positioned himself near the door, maintaining his vigil. "Gunderson mentioned my father had a German Shepherd, but I never knew its name." Your father trained that dog himself, Dr. Monroe continued, clearing papers from chairs so they could sit. Said Atlas was smarter than most people he knew. The dog understood commands in English and German, could track for miles, even learned to recognize specific objects and people from photographs. Sage leaned forward, interest piqued. When exactly did Atlas disappear? Dr. Monroe considered this. Must have been 8, maybe 9 years ago. Everett was convinced someone had taken him. The dog was too well trained to simply run away. And when did Salas show up at the ranch? Sage asked Luke, her mind clearly connecting dots. The day after I returned home, 3 months after my father died. Luke studied Salas more carefully now, noting the gray around the muzzle that suggested advanced age for a German Shepherd. You think? It's possible, Dr. Monroe interjected, following their line of thought. German Shepherds can live 12 to 14 years with good care. The timeline would fit. But why would Atlas disappear for years, then return precisely when Luke came home? Sage wondered. Dr. Monroe shrugged. Animals are more intuitive than we give them credit for, especially ones as intelligent as German Shepherds. A commotion from the waiting room interrupted their speculation. The doctor moved to her office door, opening it a crack to peer out. When she turned back, her expression was grave. 2 men in the waiting room, she whispered, asking Martha at reception if she's seen you. Luke cursed under his breath. They must have checked every business in town. There's a back door through the kennel area, Dr. Monroe offered, but you'll need to move quickly. Salas was already on his feet, sensing the change in tension. Luke gathered their backpack while Sage thanked the veterinarian. Before you go, Dr. Monroe said, opening a drawer in her desk, Everett left this with me years ago, said if anything happened to him I should give it to you when the time was right. She handed Luke a sealed envelope, his name written in his father's distinctive handwriting. I think that time is now. Luke stared at the envelope, emotions warring within him, confusion, hope, anger, that his father had prepared for his own death without ever sharing his concerns directly. There was no time to read it now, however. He tucked the envelope securely into his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said simply. Dr. Monroe nodded. The back path leads to the old railroad tracks. Follow them east and you'll reach the county road without being seen from town. As they slipped through the kennel area, the dogs inside the runs watched with curious eyes, but remained surprisingly quiet, as if sensing the need for stealth. Salas led the way once more, pausing at the rear exit to ensure no one waited outside. Rain had begun to fall, a gentle but persistent drizzle that would help mask their trail. The abandoned railroad tracks stretched before them, overgrown with weeds but still offering a clear path away from town. They had gone perhaps half a mile when Luke finally slowed their pace, reasonably confident they weren't being followed. We need to read what's in that envelope, Sage suggested, huddling under a lone pine tree that offered minimal shelter from the increasing rainfall. Luke nodded, carefully extracting the now damp envelope from his pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal, whether from cold or emotion he couldn't say. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. Luke, the letter began in his father's bold script, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and the trouble I feared has found you. I'm sorry for the secrets I kept. Sorry I couldn't find the words to explain while I was alive. Some burdens are too heavy to share, even with those we love most. Luke paused, his throat tightening. Sage moved closer, offering silent support as he continued reading. What happened to Matthew Jackson has haunted Thomas and me for 40 years. We were young, scared of Harold Whitmore's influence, and we made a choice to stay silent about what we witnessed. Harold pushed Matthew from the ravine edge during their argument. Murder, not an accident. We collected evidence afterward, but never came forward, fearing Harold's connections would protect him while destroying us. The key enclosed opens a safe deposit box at First Montana Bank in Lone Ridge, box 413. Inside is everything: soil samples from where Matthew's blood spilled before his body was moved, photographs we took secretly during the investigation, the original coroner's report showing defensive wounds that were omitted from the final version, enough to prove what really happened, even after all these years. When Marshall Parker returned to town last year, buying up land and planning his resort on the exact spot where his father died, Thomas and I knew it wasn't coincidence. We started comparing notes, worried Parker had somehow learned the truth and was planning something. Then Thomas started feeling sick with symptoms that didn't make sense. If you're with Sage Whitmore now, protect her. Parker will target both of you to bury the truth once and for all. Trust Atlas. I trained him for this possibility, taught him to find you and lead you to the cabin if needed. He's more than a dog. He's the insurance I pray you'll never need. I wasn't the father you deserved, Luke. War changed me in ways I couldn't explain, left me unable to show the love I felt. But know this: I've always been proud of the man you became. Braver and better than I ever was. The letter was signed simply, Dad. Luke stared at the paper, raindrops mingling with tears he hadn't realized were falling. The father he'd thought emotionally unavailable, perhaps even indifferent, had been carrying an impossible burden all along, had been proud of him, had prepared meticulously to protect him from beyond the grave. He trained Atlas Solis to find me, Luke said finally, his voice rough with emotion, to lead me to you if something happened to him. Sage was wiping her own tears. Our fathers knew Parker might come after them. They created this elaborate safeguard, evidence hidden in a bank, a dog trained to connect their children if they were gone. Solis moved closer, pressing against Luke's leg as if offering comfort. Looking at the aging German shepherd now, Luke saw him with new eyes. Not just a stray that had appeared by coincidence, but his father's most loyal companion, fulfilling one final mission. First Montana Bank, Sage said, focusing on their immediate needs. We need to get to that safe deposit box before Parker realizes what we've found. Luke carefully refolded the letter, tucking it and the key into his pocket. The bank's on the opposite side of town. We'll need to circle around, avoid Main Street entirely. They continued along the railroad tracks until reaching the county road, then cut through fields and woodland to approach Lone Ridge from the west. The rain had intensified, soaking through their clothing, but providing welcome cover as they moved stealthily toward their destination. First Montana Bank stood on a corner lot, its brick facade and columns offering a veneer of small-town stability. Through the large windows, Luke could see several customers inside, along with uniformed staff. No sign of Parker or his men. "How do we do this?" Sage asked, both of them dripping wet and looking far from presentable. "We can't exactly waltz in looking like this without drawing attention." Luke considered their options. "You go in alone. You're less recognizable to Parker's men than I am. Say you got caught in the rain while jogging. Ask to use the bathroom to dry off, then request access to the safe deposit box. I'll wait with Solis and keep watch. Will they let me access it? The key is in your father's name." "Small-town banks work differently," Luke assured her. "Mention Everett Callahan was your godfather, left you access in his will. Most of the tellers knew my father. They'll want to help." Sage nodded, straightening her sodden clothing as best she could and attempting to smooth her rain-plastered hair. "I'll be as quick as possible." "Be careful," Luke cautioned. "If anything seems wrong, abort and walk out. We'll find another way." She squeezed his hand briefly before crossing the street and entering the bank. Luke positioned himself in the doorway of a closed antique shop across the street, partially hidden while maintaining a clear view of the bank entrance. Solis sat beside him, equally vigilant despite his wet fur. Minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Luke watched Sage speak to a teller, gesture apologetically at her appearance, then disappear toward the restrooms. 10 minutes later, she re-emerged, looking marginally drier, and was escorted to the bank's safe deposit area by an older woman who appeared to be the manager. Luke's tension mounted with each passing minute. 20 minutes. 30. His military training helped him maintain outward calm, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. It shouldn't take this long. Finally, Sage appeared at the bank entrance, walking casually until she was outside, then quickening her pace to rejoin Luke. Her expression was triumphant despite her bedraggled appearance. "Got it," she whispered, indicating her purse. "Everything your father mentioned and more." The manager remembered Everett fondly, didn't question my story at all. Relief washed over Luke. "Let's get somewhere safe to examine it properly." "Where? We can't go back to the ranch or into town." Luke considered their limited options. "The church at the edge of town. Father Matthews knows me from before I enlisted. He'll give us sanctuary without asking too many questions." St. Margaret's Church sat on a quiet side street, its modest steeple barely visible above the surrounding pine trees. The stone building had stood for over a century, weathering Montana winters and changing times with equal resilience. Father Matthews, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a professor's demeanor, welcomed them without hesitation despite their disheveled state. "Luke Callahan," he greeted warmly. "It's been years. Your father's funeral was the last time, I believe." "We need a quiet place for a few hours, Father," Luke explained. "It's important." The priest nodded, requiring no further explanation. "The meeting room behind the sanctuary is empty today. Take all the time you need." He smiled at Solace, who sat politely at Luke's side. "Your companion is welcome too, though he's the first dog I've had in these halls." "He's special," Luke replied simply. Father Matthews showed them to a comfortable room with a large table, offering towels and the use of the church's ancient radiators to dry their wet clothing. Once alone, Sage emptied the contents of her purse onto the table, a sealed evidence bag containing soil samples, a manila envelope of photographs, and several official-looking documents protected in plastic sleeves. "Your father was meticulous," she remarked, spreading out the items. "He documented everything like a professional investigator." The photographs told a grim story. Images of the ravine where Matthew Jackson had died, close-ups of disturbed earth and drag marks, and most damning, a boot print preserved in mud that matched a distinctive pattern worn by Harold Whitmore in other photos. The soil samples were labeled with coordinates and notes indicating the presence of blood. Most revealing was the original coroner's report, complete with hand-drawn diagrams showing defensive wounds on Matthew's arms and hands, injuries inconsistent with an accidental fall, but perfectly aligned with fighting off an attacker before being pushed. "This would have been enough to reopen the case even without the recording," Luke observed, carefully examining each item. "Why didn't they come forward?" "Fear," Sage suggested. "Small town, powerful family, and once they'd kept silent initially, coming forward later would have implicated them in the cover-up." "So they carried it for decades," Luke shook his head, imagining the weight of such a secret, "until Parker returned and threatened to expose everything. And instead of facing justice for his father's death, Parker decided to eliminate the witnesses and build his resort," Sage added bitterly, "erasing the past completely." Solace, who had been sleeping near the radiator, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he rose to his feet, staring intently at the door. Luke immediately tensed, years of combat training kicking in. "Someone's coming." "Father Matthews," Sage whispered, hopefully, gathering the evidence back into her purse. He would have knocked. Luke moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against it. Muffled voices came from the church's main entrance. Multiple people, male, speaking with urgent tones. "We need another exit," he whispered, scanning the room. A small window overlooked the church cemetery, probably just large enough for them to squeeze through. Before they could move, The door burst open. Two of Parker's men stood in the doorway, expressions grim and determined. Behind them in the hallway, Luke glimpsed Father Matthews being restrained by a third man, apologetic fear in the priest's eyes. "Into the line, Callahan," the larger of the two men said, advancing into the room. "Parker wants what you took from the bank." Silas sprang forward with a ferocious bark, positioning himself between the intruders and his humans. The sudden aggression from the previously calm dog momentarily startled the men, giving Luke precious seconds to assess their options. The room offered little tactical advantage. A heavy table, chairs, and a wooden podium were the only potential weapons, or barriers. The window remained their best escape route, but reaching it would require moving past the men. "Give us the evidence," the second man demanded, recovering from his initial surprise at Silas's protective display. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." "Like our fathers didn't get hurt?" Sage challenged, her voice steady despite the danger. "Tell Parker we know everything. How his father discovered Harold Whitmore's embezzlement, how Harold murdered him, how our fathers witnessed it, and how Parker poisoned them both when they started comparing notes," Luke added, watching for any reaction that might confirm their theory. A flicker of unease crossed the first man's face. "We're just here for the documents. What happened to your fathers isn't our concern." "But it is Marshall Parker's concern," Luke pressed, "because he came back to Lone Ridge for revenge, not business. The resort is just a cover to destroy the place where his father died." "Enough talking," the larger man snapped, reaching inside his jacket. The movement revealed the outline of a concealed weapon. "The evidence! Now!" What happened next unfolded with the chaotic precision of combat. Silas launched himself at the armed man, clamping powerful jaws around his wrist before he could draw his weapon. Luke simultaneously charged the second intruder, tackling him into the hallway. Sage scrambled for the window, working to open the rusted latch. The church's peaceful silence shattered with shouts, growls, and the crash of overturned furniture. Luke grappled with his opponent on the hallway floor, years of military hand-to-hand training giving him the advantage despite the man's size. A solid punch to the solar plexus left the man gasping. Inside the meeting room, Silas maintained his grip on the armed intruder's wrist, drawing a howl of pain. The man slammed his free hand against the dog's head, trying to dislodge him, but Silas's determination was unshakable. "Luke," Sage called, having finally wrenched the window open, "we need to go." Luke delivered one final strike to ensure his opponent stayed down, then turned back toward the meeting room. The scene inside stopped him cold. The man Silas had attacked had managed to draw his weapon with his free hand and now had it pointed at the dog. "Call him off or I shoot," the man demanded, blood streaming from his savaged wrist. Time seemed to slow as Luke assessed the impossible situation. Silas wouldn't release his grip unless commanded. Everett had trained him too well for that. But the moment he did, they'd lose their only advantage. A sudden commotion from the church's front entrance drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Ramirez's authoritative voice calling out, "Police! Drop your weapons!" The momentary distraction was all Silas needed. The German shepherd released the man's wrist only to lunge for the gun hand instead, his powerful jaws clamping down with precision born of specialized training. The weapon clattered to the floor as the man screamed in pain. "Luke, now!" Sage urged from the window, already halfway through it. He scooped up the dropped gun, backing toward the window while maintaining coverage on both downed men. "Silas, come!" The German shepherd immediately released his grip and bounded to Luke's side. With practiced efficiency, Luke helped him through the window, followed by his own hasty exit just as Ramirez and two deputies reached the meeting room doorway. "This way!" Sage called, already running toward the cemetery's rear gate. Silas raced ahead, leading them through the headstones toward the forest edge beyond. They ran until their lungs burned, Silas guiding them along game trails and natural clearings, always moving away from town. Eventually, they reached a small stream where Luke finally called a halt, all three of them desperately needing to catch their breath. "How did they find us?" Sage gasped, collapsing onto a fallen log. "Someone must have seen you at the bank," Luke suggested, checking Solace for injuries. The dog appeared unharmed despite the fierce confrontation, though dried blood from his opponent matted his muzzle fur. "Or they were watching all possible locations." Ramirez arrived just in time, Sage noted, the adrenaline spike beginning to fade from her system. "How did he know where we were?" Luke shook his head, equally puzzled. Maybe Father Matthews managed to call him, or Clara told him where we might have gone. Solace suddenly perked up, ears swiveling toward the forest behind them. Luke tensed, raising the confiscated weapon, but relaxed when the dog's tail began to wag, a friendly recognition rather than an alert. Moments later, Sheriff Ramirez emerged from the trees, alone and slightly winded from the trek. "Figured you'd head this way," he said, approaching cautiously with hands visible. "Your dog's tracking abilities are impressive." "How did you know we were at the church?" Luke asked, lowering the gun but maintaining his guard. "Clara said you were looking for somewhere safe. Church seemed logical." Ramirez stopped a respectful distance away. "I've got Parker in custody." Sage stood abruptly. "On what charges?" "Attempted murder. We have 2 witnesses who'll testify he ordered the shots fired at you near the cabin, breaking and entering at the Callahan Ranch, arson for the cabin fire." The sheriff's expression was grim but satisfied. "His men are talking to save themselves, confirming he ordered everything." "What about our fathers?" Luke pressed. Ramirez sighed. "That's more complicated. We're getting warrants for exhumations, toxicology tests. It'll take time to prove, if it can be proven at all. We have evidence connecting Parker to the original crime, Matthew Jackson's murder," Sage said, indicating her purse. "Recordings, photographs, the original coroner's report showing it wasn't an accident." "Which gives Parker motive for silencing your fathers," Ramirez nodded. "It's all circumstantial regarding their deaths, but enough to keep him locked up while we investigate further." Luke studied the sheriff carefully. "You knew more than you let on all along, didn't you?" A shadow crossed Ramirez's weathered features. "Your father and I served together before I joined the department. He never gave details, but he made me promise to watch out for you if anything happened to him. Said there were old ghosts that might come back someday. And when they did, you kept your promise," Luke concluded, a new respect forming for the lawman. "Best I could," Ramirez gestured toward town. "It's safe to come back now. Parker's men are in custody, too." As they walked slowly back toward Lone Ridge, Solace trotting ahead as their unofficial scout, Luke found himself processing the whirlwind of revelations. His father, the emotionally distant, often stern Everett Callahan, had meticulously arranged protection for his son, preserving evidence and even training his beloved dog to find Luke when needed. The man Luke had believed didn't care enough to connect had, in his own way, never stopped watching over him. "Your father loved you," Sage said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "He just didn't know how to show it while he was alive." "Like Thomas with you," Luke replied. "They both carried burdens they thought would protect us. And in the end, they found a way to help us uncover the truth, even after they were gone." Sage's hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally, through each other. 6 months passed, winter giving way to spring across the Montana landscape. The Callahan Ranch gradually transformed under Luke and Sage's combined efforts. Broken fences mended, the barn roof repaired, and new life breathed into spaces long neglected. Each improvement felt symbolic, physical manifestations of their own healing processes. Marshall Parker awaited trial from the county jail, his carefully constructed empire crumbling as investigators uncovered financial irregularities throughout his development company. The exhumations of Thomas Whitmore and Everett Callahan had confirmed what Luke and Sage already believed. Trace amounts of a sophisticated poison were found in both men's systems, administered gradually over weeks to mimic natural heart failure. Additional charges of first-degree murder were added to Parker's growing list of crimes. The site where the Whitmore cabin had stood remained scarred by fire, but spring's persistent green growth had begun to reclaim the edges of the clearing. Luke and Sage visited occasionally, sometimes sitting in contemplative silence, other times sharing stories of their fathers. They'd pieced together from journals and town memories. "We should rebuild it," Sage suggested one crisp April morning as they stood among the cabin's charred remains. "Not exactly as it was, but something new. A place that honors the past without being consumed by it." Luke considered the idea, watching Solace explore the perimeter of the clearing with his typical methodical attention. The German Shepherd had become their constant companion, his age showing in the increased gray around his muzzle, but his spirit undimmed. "A memorial of sorts," Luke agreed, "but also a place for the future." Their relationship had evolved gradually, neither rushing what both recognized as something worth nurturing carefully. They'd begun as reluctant allies thrown together by circumstance and shared trauma. Now they were partners in every sense, working side by side at the ranch, supporting each other through nightmares and dark moments, and building something neither had dared hope for after their respective losses. The town of Lone Ridge had embraced them as heroes of a sort, though Luke was uncomfortable with such recognition. Clara's Cafe featured a framed newspaper article about the 40-year mystery solved, and Mr. Gunderson proudly told anyone who would listen how he'd known something wasn't right about that Parker fellow from day one. Sheriff Ramirez had become a regular visitor to the ranch, initially checking on their safety, but eventually coming for the simple pleasure of company and Sage's improving cooking skills. During one such visit, he had brought a proposition from the town council. "They want to establish a historical preservation trust," he explained over coffee at the kitchen table, "using the seized assets from Parker's company to maintain sites significant to Lone Ridge's history. They're asking if you'd both consider serving on the board." "Us?" Luke had questioned, surprised by the request. "You've got a unique perspective on the importance of preserving history," Ramirez replied. "Plus, the Whitmore and Callahan names still carry weight around here." Sage had accepted immediately, her journalist's instincts drawn to the idea of preserving authentic stories. Luke had been more hesitant but eventually agreed, recognizing the healing potential of channeling their experience into something constructive. Today, as they walked from the cabin site back toward Luke's truck, Sage paused to examine early wildflowers pushing through the soil. "Life finds a way," she murmured, a phrase she'd repeated often during their darkest moments. Luke watched her, still sometimes struck by how seamlessly she had integrated into his life, how natural her presence felt in spaces once defined by loneliness. "We should talk about your lease," he said, the words emerging before he'd fully formulated his thoughts. Sage straightened, brushing dirt from her jeans. "My lease? At the Silver Pine? It's up next week." Luke shifted his weight, suddenly feeling like an awkward teenager rather than a combat-hardened veteran. "Seems unnecessary when you spend most nights at the ranch anyway." A slow smile spread across her face. "Luke Callahan, are you asking me to move in with you?" "I'm saying it makes practical sense," he replied, attempting to maintain some facade of casualness, though his racing heart betrayed him. "The ranch is big enough for both of us. Plus, Solace would miss you." At the sound of his name, the German Shepherd looked up expectantly, tail wagging in what Luke could have sworn was approval. "Ah, for Solace's sake, then," Sage teased, closing the distance between them. "How could I possibly refuse?" The kiss they shared was gentle but filled with promise, of a home rebuilt, of nightmares gradually replaced by dreams, of a future neither had imagined possible before. A remarkable dog led them to each other. The following week brought the first meeting of the Lone Ridge Historical Preservation Trust. The gathered board members, a mix of longtime residents and younger voices, listened attentively as Sage outlined her vision for documenting the town's complex history, beginning with the proper recognition of the Whitmore-Jackson tragedy. "We can't change the past," she concluded, her professional demeanor belying the personal stake she had in the project. "But we can ensure it's remembered honestly, learn from it, and build something better." Dr. Monroe, who had also joined the trust, suggested creating educational materials about the town's evolution. The good and the difficult parts, as she put it. Mr. Gunderson proposed restoring some of the original ranch structures as living museums. Luke, more comfortable with action than words, offered the practical skills he'd developed both in military service and in rehabilitating the Callahan property. "I can help assess which structures are salvageable and coordinate volunteer restoration efforts," he said, surprising himself with his willingness to engage with the community he'd once felt so disconnected from. After the meeting, they drove home along roads lined with spring greenery, Solace riding in the truck bed with his usual dignified posture. Home, the word had taken on new meaning for both of them, no longer just a physical place, but the sense of belonging they'd created together. At the ranch, Luke found himself drawn to his father's study, a room he'd once avoided but now visited regularly. Among Everett's belongings, he continued to discover small insights into the man he'd never fully understood in life. Military commendations tucked away rather than displayed, books on child psychology with careful annotations, photographs of Luke's achievements preserved with quiet pride. "Your father was planning to reach out," Sage said from the doorway, observing him examining an old photo album. "His last journal entries mentioned wanting to bridge the gap before it was too late." "I wish he had," Luke admitted, the regret still occasionally sharp despite the healing months had brought. "I wish we'd had the chance to really talk man to man." "In some ways you still did." Sage entered the room, sitting beside him on the small sofa. "Through his preparations, his journal, Solace, he found a way to speak to you." Luke nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. His father had communicated in the only ways he knew how, through action, preparation, protection, not unlike how Luke himself had operated for much of his life. Solace entered the study, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The dog had developed an uncanny knack for appearing whenever conversations turned emotional, offering his steady presence as comfort. He settled at their feet with a contented sigh. "The vet says he's doing well for his age," Luke commented, reaching down to scratch behind the shepherd's ears. "But she mentioned we should start preparing ourselves. Large breeds don't typically live much beyond 12 to 14 years. "And he's at least 12 now," Sage acknowledged quietly. They'd both become deeply attached to the remarkable dog who had brought them together. Luke's last living connection to his father, and in many ways the guardian of both their healing processes. "I've been thinking about something," Luke said after a comfortable silence. "The memorial at the cabin site. What if we made it more than just a historical marker? What if it became something functional, something that helps others?" Sage looked at him with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "A sanctuary of sorts. For veterans, maybe, or anyone who needs space to heal." The idea had been forming gradually in Luke's mind, inspired by his own journey from isolation to connection. Somewhere quiet where people can work with their hands, be in nature, find purpose while they process whatever they're carrying. "Therapy dogs," Sage added, immediately grasping his vision. "German shepherds, trained like Solace, to provide companionship and support. We could call it Whitmore Callahan Haven," Luke suggested. "Honor both our fathers while creating something new from the ashes of the past." Sage's eyes brightened with emotion and approval. "It's perfect! A place where loss becomes healing, where broken things are made whole again." Through the study window, the Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the rejuvenated ranch. Solace lifted his head, perhaps sensing the shift in energy. his wise eyes moving between the two humans who had become his family. "We should talk to Ramirez about using some of the trust funds to get started," Luke continued, the idea gaining momentum as he spoke. "Dr. Monroe could help with the therapy dog program, and Clara would probably organize half the town to volunteer with construction. And I could document the whole process," Sage added. "The story of how a 40-year-old tragedy ultimately created something beautiful for the community." As night fell across the Callahan Ranch, they continued refining the vision, their conversation flowing effortlessly between practical considerations and deeper reflections. Outside, stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, the same stars that had witnessed decades of secrets and suffering, now shining down on possibility and redemption. Spring turned to summer, and construction began at the Whitmore cabin site. The town had embraced the sanctuary concept with enthusiasm, volunteers appearing weekends to clear debris, prepare foundations, and raise the frame of a new structure designed to honor the original cabin's rustic charm while incorporating modern elements of accessibility and comfort. Luke found unexpected healing in the physical labor, working alongside men and women from town who had known his father, sharing stories and gradually redefining his place in the community. Sage documented the process with her journalist's eye, creating a narrative that wove together past and present, personal and communal. Solace supervised the construction with dignified attention, earning treats and affection from volunteers who'd all heard the remarkable story of the German shepherd who led a veteran to a remote cabin and changed the course of many lives. Though slowing with age, he remained vigilant, particularly when Luke and Sage were nearby. On a warm August evening, as the sanctuary's main building neared completion, they hosted a small gathering at the site. Sheriff Ramirez brought steaks for the grill, Clara contributed her famous potato salad, and Dr. Monroe arrived with 2 German Shepherd puppies she was training for the future therapy program. "To new beginnings," Ramirez toasted, raising his beer bottle as the group gathered around picnic tables set beneath pine trees at the clearing's edge. "And to remembering what matters." "To Everett and Thomas," Dr. Monroe added, "who would be proud of what their children have created." The evening unfolded with easy conversation and occasional laughter, the kind of simple community gathering that had once seemed impossible to Luke in his isolated grief. Watching Sage in animated discussion with Clara about upcoming sanctuary programs, he felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected path his life had taken. Solace appeared at his side, leaning lightly against his leg in their familiar gesture of connection. Luke knelt to embrace the aging dog, burying his fingers in the thick fur, still soft despite the increasing gray. "You did good, boy," he murmured, emotion tightening his throat. "Dad would be proud of you, too." The German shepherd looked at him with those knowing eyes that had witnessed so much. War and homecoming, grief and healing, isolation and connection. In those eyes, Luke sometimes glimpsed his father's steadfast spirit. The unspoken love that had ensured his son would never truly be alone. Later that night, after their guests had departed and they'd returned to the ranch, Luke and Sage sat on the porch swing watching fireflies illuminate the summer darkness. Solace lay at their feet, his breathing deep and contented in sleep. "I've been thinking," Sage said, her head resting comfortably against Luke's shoulder, "about what we've built these past months. The sanctuary, the historical trust, this home." "Regrets?" Luke asked, though he already knew the answer. "The opposite." She shifted to face him. "I feel like I've found exactly where I'm supposed to be, who I'm supposed to be with." The vulnerability in her voice touched something deep within him. They'd shared so much, trauma and healing, danger and safety, the unraveling of family mysteries and the building of new traditions. Yet neither had spoken directly about the future beyond their immediate projects. "I feel the same way," he admitted, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Never thought I'd find this kind of peace after everything. Never thought I'd find someone who understands the darkest parts without flinching." Sage's hand found his in the darkness. We were both lost in different ways, preparing to give up. "Until a German shepherd with a mission brought us together," Luke finished, glancing down at Solace, who had opened one eye as if aware he was being discussed. "I used to think finding meaning after loss was impossible," Sage continued. "That grief was just an endless tunnel with no exit." Her voice softened. "I don't think that anymore." The night wrapped around them, crickets providing gentle accompaniment to their conversation. In the distance, an owl called, its haunting sound echoing across the fields that had sustained generations of Callahans. "I bought something today," Luke said after a comfortable silence. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box that he'd carefully selected at Mr. Gunderson's store earlier in the week. Had it in mind for a while, but today felt right. Sage's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a Montana sapphire set in silver. Not ostentatious, but beautiful in its understated clarity, much like the woman herself. "I'm not good with flowery speeches," Luke began, his heart pounding despite the certainty he felt. "Military training teaches precision, getting to the point." A smile touched Sage's lips. "Then get to the point, soldier." "I love you," he said simply. "We found each other in the strangest circumstances, but it feels like exactly where we were meant to be. I don't want to waste any more time. We've both seen how fragile life can be." He took a steadying breath. "Sage Whitmore, will you marry me?" Tears glistened in her eyes, visible even in the porch's dim light. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her fingers, Solace rose from his spot on the porch, tail wagging with what Luke could only interpret as approval. The German shepherd pressed against both of them, completing the circle of family they had formed. In that moment, the grief that had once defined both their lives didn't disappear. It never would completely, but it found its proper place in the larger tapestry of their experience. No longer the dominant thread, but one strand among many in a richer, more complex pattern they continued to weave together. The Whitmore Callahan Haven opened officially that autumn as Montana's aspens turned golden and the air carried the first hints of coming winter. A simple plaque at the entrance bore the names of 4 men, Thomas Whitmore, Everett Callahan, Matthew Jackson, and Atlas, whose intertwined stories had ultimately led to this place of healing. The first veterans arrived in October, men and women carrying visible and invisible wounds from conflicts around the world. They found in the haven what Luke had once desperately needed himself: quiet understanding, meaningful work, and the unconditional acceptance of therapy dogs descended from Solace's training lineage. Sage's documentation of the project gained national attention, bringing recognition to Lone Ridge and additional funding for similar programs across the country. Luke found himself reluctantly speaking at veterans events, sharing how his own journey from isolation to connection had shaped the Haven's mission. Their wedding took place at the sanctuary on a clear November day, with changing leaves providing a natural cathedral of red and gold around them. The ceremony was small but meaningful. Sheriff Ramirez serving as best man, Clara and Dr. Monroe standing with Sage, and Solace carrying the rings in a small pouch attached to his collar. Father Matthews officiated, speaking eloquently about redemption and second chances, about finding light in unexpected places. "These 2 souls," he concluded, "remind us that even the deepest wounds can become openings for love to enter. That when we face our darkest truths together, we find our way toward healing." As Luke and Sage exchanged vows beneath the Montana sky, with Solace sitting attentively between them, they each silently acknowledged the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey that began with a German shepherd appearing at the edge of a broken fence line, carrying out one final mission for the father who had trained him. Later that evening, as guests celebrated in the sanctuary's main hall, Luke and Sage slipped away briefly with Solace to visit the small memorial garden planted where the original cabin had stood. 4 stone markers honored the men whose lives and deaths had shaped their path, surrounded by native plants that would return year after year despite Montana's harsh seasons. "I think they know," Sage said softly, her hand fitting perfectly in Luke's. "Somehow? I think they see what's grown from their sacrifice." Luke nodded, words unnecessary between them now. Solace pressed against their legs, his presence a living connection to all that had come before. The grief and secrets, but also the love and protection that had transcended death itself. As they walked back toward the lights and music of their wedding celebration, Luke reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him home in every sense of the word. From battlefields to a broken ranch, from isolation to community, from a chance encounter with a German shepherd to a love he had never dared imagine possible. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.